Hey there, SHIRO listeners, SaturnDave here, reminding you that you must play Sega Saturn, and that it's contributions from listeners like you that help keep this and our other shows hosted and available on demand, in addition to our website, SegaSaturnShiro.com, where you can find all of the most up-to-date news and information from around the Sega Saturn scene. If you'd like to show your support and gain access to several perks, visit patreon.com/SHIRO Media Group to become a Patreon supporter. If a monthly donation isn't possible, no worries. We still value your support in liking and sharing our content on social media and joining our Discord community to become a part of the Saturn conversation. Thank you for being a loyal listener and a part of this great community. And as always, hey everyone, welcome to SHIRO Editor's Corner. I'm SaturnDave, and I'm joined by a stable of guests today. I've got my buddy Pat TraynoCo.
Yo, how's it going?
Awesome, awesome. And I've got the Sega guys, both Dan, the Mega Driver, and James, the Segaholic. How you guys doing?
Yeah, good.
I call him the Genesis driver.
Oh, good.
The Genesis driver? Yeah,
the Genesis.
Want to localize it. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, we have Mel, Sega Lord X. How are you doing, bro?
I'm doing great, man. How you doing?
Doing amazing, and thank you for joining us. We have quite a panel here to talk about a really cool topic. Today we're talking about arcades. But it's funny how this came about, because what really happened is I wanted to talk to everyone about gaming in the 90s, you know, like what it was like to be a gamer in the 90s versus, you know, versus nowadays, and what kids are missing out on, and how, you know, how much things were different, like in almost every way. But as we were talking, kind of like prepping or planning for this future cast, we just started talking about arcades. And then it dawned on me, like, arcades are such a huge part of gaming in the 90s that they deserve their entire own episode. They could probably justify multiple episodes, but we're going to try to knock out 90s arcade gaming in one episode here. I don't want to go through like the history of arcades. You know, I don't want to go all the way back to like Pong. We can talk, you know, Williams, Bally, and Midway, Taito, that, you know, wherever this conversation takes us is fine, but I want to keep it rooted in kind of like either late 80s or early 90s, you know, because I really feel like the 90s were kind of like the last bastion of the arcades that we knew. Like, as we moved on into the aughts, the arcade changed. I wouldn't say that it completely died, but it changed quite a bit from what we knew. And what I want to start with is just talking about how ubiquitous arcades were. So like nowadays, you know, James goes to like a barcade, right, to kind of relive that experience, you know, or Pat has to go.
I mean, a lot of us do.
You do. You kind of have to go nowadays to like a bespoke establishment that tries to recreate that experience that was pretty much everywhere when we grew up as kids. Okay, like I want to talk about how like arcades were literally everywhere. You had them in movie theaters, pizza joints, casinos, resorts, mini golf, laundromat. Your convenience store was an arcade. Your skating rinks, your bowling alleys, your restaurant waiting areas, your grocery stores, even my dentist office that I grew up going to the dentist office had a waiting area with an arcade. So I remember
a nail salon that my mom went to had an arcade too.
A nail salon.
Yeah,
I think you got me beat. Like the nail salon is a little bit more impressive than even the dentist office.
Maybe it was a Jersey thing. I don't know.
I kind of wanted to go around the room and just talk about that a little bit. And can you remember there being arcades just like everywhere you went? It wasn't like you had to go search out an arcade. You just pretty much had arcade cabinets pretty much everywhere, you know, which is not really the case nowadays. How about you, Mel? Like, you're the oldest out of this group, I think. You're the senior.
So this is not Robert into the poor game, man.
Well,
what a way to start, Dave, man.
But he's our senior.
I want to hear the UK experience, too. Well, I want to hear the UK experience after Mel, though.
So let's start with Mel, and then let's go James, and I'll go last. That's fine.
You know, man, when I was growing, let me first give you the environment.
Okay.
I grew up in a podunk mountain town. Like, the town itself has like maybe 40,000 people in it, and you have to drive north or west or south for hours to hit any kind of population center in the state and the area that I grew up in. And in the 80s on into the 90s, every place, even in my little rinky dink ass town, pretty much had arcade games. You went to the grocery store, they had one or two arcade machines in the front. You went to 7-Eleven, there was an arcade machine or two in the front. So I mean, it was impossible to miss arcade games back then, which, of course, for a kid that enjoyed playing arcade games, that was like the best thing ever because it didn't really matter where you went. As long as you were in public, you were going to eventually run into the arcade games that you wanted to see and play. And then, of course, you had the bigger arcade, the bigger places that carried arcade games, your indoor mall. Our indoor mall had a place called Fun and Games here, and it was a sizable, arcade, and they got everything new as it came out. It was so awesome because every time you went there, they had some kind of new game in there for you to see and play. So, of course, getting around and playing all of that stuff, I was able to play most of the stuff as it came out, throughout the 90s. And that was what was so important about the 90s too, which is probably you all's experience as well. The games changed so much. Like in the early 80s, you were still sort of banging away at like really great looking 2D games. Then like 92, 93, you started to see this big explosion in games starting to try to be 3D polygons. And then of course the mid 90s hit and you've got fully textured mapped polygons. And then the deeper you go into the 90s, you just see this technological explosion where games start looking so much better that it was almost like you wanted to go to the arcade as much as possible because you wanted to be a part of seeing that technology change and evolve so rapidly. And that was probably one of the coolest things about the arcade in the 90s. Not just that it was everywhere, but it advanced so rapidly. So every time you saw something, there were these huge just spikes and how much better everything looked or ran or personally that was the best part of the 90s for me.
So in your little town that you grew up, what would you say was like your favorite place to hang out or your favorite arcade that you remember, even if it was a tiny one?
Yeah, the best one that we had was actually a small one. It was in a bowling alley called Kegler's.
Yeah.
And they didn't have but probably 10 or 15 machines in there.
Right.
But they had all fighting games. So the second Street Fighter 2 came out, they had it. Champion Edition came out, they had it. Killer Instinct came out, they had it. Mortal Kombat 2, they had it. So of course, everybody that wanted to play fighting games or were good at fighting games, that's where you went because everybody in town knew if you wanted to see the latest fighting game, you gravitated towards, the bowling alley there. And of course, that's where you learn to get good at games because you were playing people that they knew how to play. So not only were you picking up tips from them and watching them play, but you were playing against them too. So it wasn't just the computer that was teaching you to play. You were being taught by other players. And if you know anything about fighting games, it's playing somebody else that you really learn the game. So that was like so cool, man, because all of my friends, people we went to school with, the college kids would go there. And there was always this little room, 10 or 15 arcade machines in it, was packed with people just playing, machine to machine, competitively. And that was like, it was like that for years. And that was so awesome.
That's awesome. So in Scotland specifically with you, James, what was it like growing up in the 90s with arcades? What was your favorite place to hang and what was the arcade scene like?
Well, for me, it's kind of a polar opposite to Mel. He says he grew up in a kind of smaller town, but I'm from Glasgow, so I'm like the Scotland's largest city. So our city centres, our chip shops, our bowling alleys all had arcades. Like, remember there was one arcade or one bowling alley called the Mega Bowl, which was like maybe 15 minutes, from my house. and in there, as you walked in the door, it was an arcade that you got first. You had to almost walk through an arcade to get to the bowling. In fact, it was people wouldn't actually mainly go bowling; they would just go for the arcades. One kind of funny memory I've got is there's a chip shop in Glasgow, a chain of chip shops called the Blue Lagoon, right? And that's where I first seen WrestleFest. They had a WrestleFest and a Power Drift arcade machine side by side.
Nice.
So you go in for your fish supper, and you have a a Royal Rumble or a game as Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior, while you're waiting.
Yeah.
But it was like every, much like what Mel was saying as well, it's like you would go to like kind of different locations and you would just see an arcade machine pop up. There was like trying what it was. It wasn't like a kind of larger news agent. And they had a Virtua Cop, but it wasn't the big deluxe machine. It was just the kind of basic stand-up cab that they had. It wasn't the kind of the big.
Yeah, it's like a square one, version. Really, with the two guns in the holster.
Yeah, they just had this kind of slimmer one, just a random Virtua Cop there. But the main place that I used to go was Booth's Enterprises in Union Street in Glasgow, and it's still there today. But very much a stripped down version of what it was. It was, it's all kind of slot machines now. It used to be that the way it's set up, it's kind of got these big, large double doors, and they would slide them open. And in the summer, they would always set up the 3 biggest arcade games, and they would have the screens facing out into the street. So, like, as people walk by, like they couldn't help but hear and see these games. And at one point, they had the big 3, VF2, Sega Rally, Virtua Cop, just sitting there, all running, all on deluxe cabinets. So VF2 was your big sit down. It was all the big projection ones. Also, the Sega Rally was the 2-player linked up. It was sitting there, so like you just couldn't miss it. And I always remember there was a bus stop, and it's still there, right outside this shop, this arcade. And like, as people used to stop and would be looking in and, oh, what's that? Like, people would be missing their buses because they couldn't make their way through the crowd to get there, because people were just mesmerised by seeing these games. But you used to go in, and the top floor or the ground, kind of the floor as you walked in, was a mixture of slot machines and arcade games. But the absolute zenith of that place was whenever you went in and down the escalators to the kind of basement level. And that was just everything, man. That was just like, it wasn't just Sega stuff, but your Namco stuff, but it was just anything you could want down there, and as the years went on through the 90s, they got in like the latest and greatest stuff. Now, sometimes they didn't have them for a long time. Like later on, whenever like F355 Challenge came out, like they got the big 3-screen deluxe cabinet in, and they only had it for a few weeks, and then it vanished. I don't know if maybe they had only hired it for X amount of time, or if it moved around different kind of locations or whatever. But yeah, just going through the 90s, like everything starting from like your Virtua Fighter 1, VF2, House of the Dead, Virtua Cop 2, Sega Touring Car, you name it, they were all in there. So quite fortunate that I had an uncle who didn't mind taking me in every weekend to play these games, although it wasn't quite as generous with the old cash in terms of letting me play it. It was like you got maybe like £5 worth of coins, and you had to kind of carefully select which machines you were going to play.
They were expensive. Arcades were not cheap. You could dump a lot of change into an arcade cab.
Have a lot of those gambling machines out your way as well? In the UK, did they have the gambling machines as well, like the ticket machines?
Or the ticket machine? You talk about the ones that you put like 2 pence in, and then it tries to nudge.
No, yeah, and you like get those. Was that pretty big up there? I don't know if there's any regulation with that compared to here, because it's like glorified gambling.
If you go to like caravan parks, those kind of machines are quite big in like caravan park arcades. Like kind of Haggerston Castle and kind of your, what do you call them? Your Haven caravan park sites that have got arcades in them. They're big with those. You get like a wad of like 2 pence pieces and drop them in, and they try and tip them over the edge, and it translates those coins into like tickets that you can then take to a kind of area and pick a prize, like a teddy bear or some crap like that, But yeah, it's a shame though, because like obviously booths now, The basement level's gone. They used to have an upper level, which was all pool tables. That's gone. I remember, like, whenever we started the channel, one of my ideas was to go in and actually go around Glasgow city centre and find old places where I used to play and buy games. and I went into booths and I had my phone on, and somebody came over and stuck their hand in my face and says, "No, you can't record in here, regulations on like gambling and stuff. You're not allowed to film the machines." And I'm like, all right. I just tried to explain. I used to come here a lot in the 90s and I've got a lot of good memories. And they just looked at me completely po-faced and went, "You can't record in here, turn it off." And I'm like, all right.
Yeah, okay, that sounds about right.
You've just killed the buzz, mate. That's it. Thanks very much for that. So
yeah.
So Dan or Pat, who wants to go first?
I'll let Dan go so we can get the UK stuff talked about.
So I'm probably somewhere between James and Mel. So Mel's in the mountains and James is in the city centre. I was in kind of a London suburb. So I didn't have a big arcade like Boo's or anything that I had direct access to. But most of the arcades, the main place where I played arcade games was actually our local swimming pool. So they always had 6 cabinets lined up, free facing each other. And you know, when I first started going to them, that's my earliest memory, is they had like Pit Fighter, Space Harrier, and a couple of others. And then Street Fighter 2 hit, like just like an absolute hurricane. And then there was 2 Street Fighter 2 machines. And by 1994, when Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo came out, they had 4. It was basically just Street Fighter. There was 4 Street Fighter 2 cabs and two other machines. But it's kind of like similar to what James and Mel was saying. There was arcade machines everywhere at the time. You know, there was an arcade machine in a local chip shop. There was an arcade. There was, like, I remember Strike. This was kind of later in the 90s when I was kind of going out and stuff. There was a Striker's 1945 machine in the local cab rank that, you know, after I had a few drinks, I'd be playing that while waiting for a cab to turn up, which was cool. You know, they should still have that now. That'd be a good idea. They had them everywhere. I remember them being in bars. You know, there was a pub that my dad used to go to, and they had Pit Fighter in there. That was one of the earliest memories that I had. But they changed that out, and rather than having the small Pit Fighter stand up, they had this. I went going in there one day with my dad and seeing this giant cabinet. You know, and as soon as you walked in, you could see it. And on there, you could see blood going everywhere. And I was like, "Oh my God, what's this?" And of course, it's Mortal Kombat, you know. And again, the sort of environment that you saw that in, you know, a British pub, but then you've got this deluxe Mortal Kombat game that's making all this noise and people are crowding around it. It wasn't uncommon, you know. It was a bar that I first played Simpsons Arcade. It was kind of one of my aunties had a wedding, and in the reception area, they had Virtua Fighter 3. You know, that was sorry, not Virtua Fighter 3, the original Virtua Fighter, which was you know, it was
forget the wedding.
Right. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, have them take pictures with the in front of the machine.
Yeah, I was constantly asking my mum and dad for money to play the Virtua Fighter machine while I was there, and you know, I don't want to spend time with my relatives. I just want to play Virtua Fighter.
Right.
So that was kind of my local, you know, experience. But we used to go to kind of like trips to seaside areas in the UK. You know, part of like my dad and my brother were involved in like local football teams and stuff, or soccer teams. And we'd go to like Margate and Clacton, and those places were just like nirvana for arcade machines. You know, I'd love to go out there because I'd spend, you know, forget the beach, forget getting into the sea, I'd spend the whole day in the arcades because it was, and this is where it's similar to what James was saying about Boo's. They had, you know, all the newest and greatest arcade machines they had in these sort of places,
right? And
they'd have them facing out. So I remember,
are these like boardwalks or like seaside? I keep hearing about this from like UK gamers, like how these seaside resorts or seaside.
Yeah, there's seaside towns. So they've got some piers, and the piers also had arcades on, but the main arcades were kind of on land near the sea.
Okay.
But, you know, a little bit away, but they were huge, sprawling complexes. And, you know, it's the first time I saw Daytona, USA.
Right.
And they had that, you know, like James was saying, Boo's had them facing out. You know, you walk past and you just see the deluxe cab, you know, two machines hooked up, absolutely ginormous, with this game that's completely unlike anything you've ever seen before. And you look and you're like, wow.
I know.
You know, I saw Virtua Fighter 3 for the first time there. Scud Race, and it was just, you know, when you see one of those in the wild, and because of the way that it's not like today where you've got the internet, and as soon as a game's out, you know about it. Wait, before a game's out, you've heard the rumors, you've seen the development screenshot. Yeah. All of a sudden, it's just there. And it's, oh my God, what is this thing?
Yeah.
So it was magical. And you know, towards the end of the 90s, you did notice that it died down a little bit where I lived, but you kind of in North London where I did live, you know, as I started to branch out and go out with friends, there was a lot of, you know, I used to go to the Trocadero a lot because that was, you know, I could get there, which was where Sega World was. And then there was a bunch of other Sega Worlds, like smaller ones nearby. And there was one in a place called Colindale. You'd pay a $5, you'd go in, and I'd go with my friend and his brother and his brother's friends. And we'd all play just the fighting games, and, you know, it would be like we'd play the new King of Fighters. I remember '98, there was a crowd of us all playing around, and it was just, that was, you know, in hindsight, when you look at, you know, getting away from the play to play and just putting the $5 down to play everything, that's quite where you start thinking maybe that's where it started tailing off. But at the time, it felt like the best thing ever. You know, I don't need £100 coins. I just need slap my $5 down, go in and play as much as I want.
Yeah.
See, Dan, you just unlocked a memory whenever you were talking about Simpsons Arcade there. The first place that I seen the Simpsons Arcade and Turtles Arcade was on the ferry from Dover to Cali on the Primary 7 school trip. I'm on a ferry with a foy in this ferry full of arcade machines. There's me spending my allowance on Mars ice cream bars and playing Simpsons and Turtles arcades. My God, man.
How about you, Pat? What was it like grow up in New Jersey?
Yeah, I had an interesting perspective because not only was I in that New Jersey area, like if people that don't know, that East Coast area is a lot like traveling around Europe, where it's like you just drive and get to another country within a couple hours. Pretty much same experience there, where it's like you just drive and you get to different states. And I was blessed being an only child, and my dad flew a lot, so we went to like Florida and Mexico and stuff like that, and Canada. So I had a lot of different perspectives on arcades, ranging from the gambit of a supermarket here and there to a mega arcade in Florida or something like that, in like Disney World, Disneyland area. And my family were always a big fan of arcades. Like, I can't remember a time I ever went anywhere and I didn't play some sort of video entertainment device. But to be fair, though, my dad is mostly a gambler, so he liked the, I don't know if you guys remember, they had those giant wheel things. You press a button like on the boardwalk or something. I don't know if you had in the UK, like the giant wheels that spin and it lands on coins. You get like gambling or something like that, like a stuffed animal.
Oh, okay.
It was really stupid. I was never a big fan of that. I always had to like Dad, I don't want to play the gambling ones with the tickets. I want to play the Virtua Fighters or something like that, or like the Turtles ones. So I was more a fan of those ones. I never was a big fan of the gambling based ones, but I still think some of my favorite ones, you know, all the Turtles games, Simpsons, Killer Instinct was really fun. What's the other one where it's like the animals farting or whatever? Primal Rage.
Primal Rage. Oh yeah.
I still think the one that's my favorite one is, I remember an arcade had a cliffhanger. I know this is more like 80s, but still, I was like, a lot of the arcades I went to seemed like it had a lot of the older games. So, but there's still a lot of really good ones, like, you know, Cruising USA, some of the racing ones, Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, and of course House of the Dead and Virtua Cop are two of my favorite that I remember playing a lot in the arcades, and Die Hard Arcade as well. So there's a lot of great memories, especially on like the boardwalk as well. I had something similar like Seaside Heights in New Jersey, where they had the arcades on the sea walk. So that was always kind of cool. So yeah, it was an interesting perspective, and I really enjoyed arcades back then. Like I said, I think the biggest thing I remember, it's like innovation was the biggest one I remember, seeing all the arcades getting the newer and bigger machines, or like, you know, the cooler pixelated ones like Marvel vs. Capcom or MVC2 or Street Fighter Alpha 3 and Second Impact and Third Strike. Like, I think that's the pinnacle of what I remember seeing. I was like, ow, they cannot get any better than those ones. So, but yeah, it was an interesting perspective. I liked all the unique arcades that I ran into.
Yeah, I miss how arcades were everywhere. Like, it's just not, video games exist so much on phones now and have completely taken over. We did a kind of a 180 flip where all the best technology, like you said, all the cutting edge technology was in the arcade, and that's where you went to experience the very best that video games could be. And the home was always trying to play catch up, you know, whereas we reached a point where just the tables flipped, and now it's like you go to most arcades and there's nothing there that's going to knock your socks off. Like, it's all pretty much like several years ago technology compared to like a PS5, right? You know?
Yeah, it's all about unique experiences in the arcade now. Like you know, like Initial D.
Right.
I think the biggest one is the dance. The one that's actually like you dance on it, like it's just a free DDR dance
Right.
thing.
Yeah, you were showing
Like those,
me that.
like stuff like that. Like the biggest ones are like stuff like that, like the rhythm games or the newer ones or stuff that are unique experiences that you can't get in home unless you spend hundreds on peripherals.
Yeah. I grew up in a casino town, and I've talked about this before, like on a solo cast, but like in Reno, I don't know, there wasn't a whole lot to do. I guess so. There were arcades everywhere, and I just remember that about my childhood. It was like if I could bug my parents for a quarter or two, you know, to just go off and play, or we would just sit and watch the attract mode of things like Space Harrier. When I first saw Space Harrier, you know, with the super scalar graphics and stuff, it just blew me away. And like going to our movie theater, they would always have like a tiny little area. They wouldn't always have like a huge arcade, but it was like you bought your ticket and you were waiting for your showtime, so you'd have like a little area where you could go to play some arcade games, and usually it would be like House of the Dead with the guns, you know, or sometimes they'd have games that would just really attract a lot of attention, like the Dragon's Lair cabinet. When you first saw Dragon's Lair, you know, it was like nothing you'd ever seen with the Laserdisc player and like full motion video. I remember that thing was so loud that you could hear it from like down the hall as you were going to your movie. You could still hear Dragon's Lair playing because they had that thing cranked up. And pizza joints. I was telling Mel last time when we would go to Godfather's Pizza, which was kind of one of the joints in Reno, they only had so much space for arcade cabinets. So what they did was they bought like 2 or 3 of those Neo Geo S&K cabinets, right? Each one would have like 4 games. So in total, you had like 12.
And they'd all be Metal Slug 2 and Bust a Move.
And Sam Show, you know, you'd have, yeah, you're right. Viewpoint, Bust a Move, you know, but the Baseball Stars. No, but I mean, that's the cool thing is it's like because arcades were everywhere, depending on where you went, you were likely to get a different experience. You went to 7-Eleven, like Mel said, you might just have a couple of cabinets like Ninja Turtles and I don't know, the Street Fighter or something like that. But you went to like the pizza joints that would stock those S&K cabinets, you'd get a bunch of S&K games on tap. Or if you went to like the family fun centers or the resorts, then you'd have these massive arcades with just every cutting edge game that you could possibly think of. But as Dan was saying, one phenomenon that was absolutely true is that you didn't really know what was coming with arcade games. You never, it's not like you could just read online or read in a magazine, oh, this arcade, I mean, unless there was some kind of trade magazine for arcade enthusiasts, you just kind of like walked into a venue and there's a new machine there, right? And that was like the case with, what was it, like Mortal Kombat, the first time we saw Mortal Kombat. Absolutely floored us, I'm sure, like every one of us, because who of us had seen like you know, lifelike digitized sprites like that before Mortal Kombat? And I mean, you know, Virtua Racing, when we all saw that with the sit down cockpit, or Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. That's the next thing I want to ask you guys is, did you guys have like a most memorable moment where you were just like shocked and in awe over like seeing a brand new arcade cabinet? What were those memories like?
Well, I can tell you from my perspective, one town over from where I grew up, and this would have been early 90s. So this is right around the time that I have gotten my driver's license. My friends and I are sort of just driving to places to see what we can find. And we find an Aladdin's Castle arcade in this mall in this one town over. And Aladdin's Castle at that time was owned by Namco. And, you know, they would get the deluxe Namco machines, man. I mean, the deluxe ones. That was like the Air Combat one with the gigantic screen and the sit-down chair that would move when you played it. And, you know, you would get like the gigantic screened version of Starblade, you know, where, you know, you had this huge screen and the polygon graphics, and it had this big like flight joystick that you would use to move the cursor around to do the shooting.
Right.
And one of the coolest things about this place is even though they focused on Namco stuff, they carried Sega and Capcom and all of those other ones. So whenever you went into this place, you always saw not just the latest Namco goodness, but you would typically see the latest from Sega and Capcom.
Mm.
And, it was right around, it was 93, maybe as early as 92, if you go back and include the Namco stuff, that I really started to take notice that arcade technology was starting to just change radically. Like, we would visit and we would see these big deluxe machines, and all of them were polygon. Then Virtua Fighter came out, and then you would see a couple other Model 1 games like Virtua Racing, or there was an airplane one too. What was it? Wing War, I think. That was
Wing War. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a big deluxe unit too. And I started to see these things, and I'm starting to realize, I'm like, you know what? Street Fighter may be the it thing right now, but I've got a feeling that video game technology is about to change pretty radically, like across the board.
Right.
Like polygons are going to replace everything, and you really started to see that as early as like 91, 92, because Namco and Atari were putting out games that were really fundamentally changing gameplay. And it wasn't just eye candy. This stuff was playing really well. I mean, at first it started out as just you shooting like a cursor, but then Atari put out their the helicopter polygon game, which is escaping me at the moment, the name of it. But you start to see stuff like that, and then Sega comes along with Model 1 in 93, and it's just like, you know what? Everything's going polygons. And then there's just this sharp rise and boom in technology where all of a sudden Ridge Racer is out. All of a sudden, Daytona USA is out, and then this Model 2. I mean, every time you walked into an arcade back then, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for the latest Model 2 game, because I realized no matter what else was in that arcade, that Model 2 stuff or the stuff from Namco was what was going to impress me.
Mm-hmm.
Because every time I saw one, it just utterly blew you away, because you had never seen anything like that. Even if you early adopted something like a 3DO or a Jaguar, those visuals were nothing compared to Namco and Sega's bleeding edge arcade technology. I mean, It was like you were looking at a painting done by a 2-year-old versus, a freaking Picasso, man. There was no comparison between the two. And that's kind of sad, because it's like you said, you go into an arcade now and it's like every fucking game looks like a mobile game.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they have these huge deluxe cabinets with these funky controls and, all of this like technology around it, but the actual base graphical ability is really no better than what your telephone is capable of.
And they're all gambling. A lot of them are gambling games
ticket
too.
center
it's
games, that are just focused on getting more tickets so you can try to win an iPad or something. But it's like you need 10 million tickets to win the iPad, right? So like Pat's right. It's just gambling. Like they're just trying to keep you hooked, right? And I mean, so even the style of games, and it leaves you to wonder, like, what's a young person supposed to really get out of this, or how are they supposed to look at this and find it appealing? All of the stuff that appeals to me is all the old cabinets and all the old games that really focused on like the pure gameplay. But then again, I don't even know if young kids look at that and find that appealing. They're like, oh, that's all the old shit that the old fogies like to play.
Yeah, honestly, the big ones I've seen is I don't know if you guys have it like level 1 or round 1 arcades. If you guys have any of those, like the Japanese centric arcades, those ones, a lot of that's going to be popular just based on the the big rhythm, because there's still a big rhythm game, a big fighting game community out here. So I think a lot of that's going to be the new millennial thing. But yeah, at least that's my opinion. Those are barcades, are the big ones.
Yeah, I saw a lot of those rhythm games in Japan, and they were really popular because they all have the bespoke units, the huge, like, and a lot of them will set up, like Konami had a number of big, deluxe cabinets out there because they had essentially like an arcade version of Rock Band. Their latest Bimani line has a full drum kit a guitar, and everything. And Sega and Namco have a bunch of Bemani or rhythm games out there, and they were really popular. What I noticed in Japan was that at the bottom floor, you'd have multi-level arcades. A lot of them were multi-level arcades, and the bottom floors would be claw machines and gachapons. And then when you get to the more traditional arcades, it would be, depending on the size, second, third, fourth floor, they'd be quite busy with, the younger generation. But they'd all be playing either these rhythm games or they'd be playing these card-based games. And these card-based games they'll take their deck of cards and, collecting cards is really popular out there, and it's kind of weaving into the gameplay. So there's Gundam games where I was seeing players battle each other, and there's a stick and there's buttons on there, but their main thing is like these deck of cards that they have on there, and they're slamming these down to choose their mecha and stuff, which is really cool. And I suppose that's what's hooking them, the younger generation, to like the arcade. Well, that's the attempt. I know arcades are still dying a little bit of a death out in Japan, but that's what it seems to be the hook for the younger generation in Japan, at least.
A lot of Japanese cabs are online too, like they're connected. They have internet connected.
Yeah.
So you could be playing against somebody who's in another arcade way across town or something like that, and that's a draw.
Yeah.
But it's
I played 3TB online.
Oh, did you? Nice.
Yeah, I got absolutely annihilated on there as well.
Yeah,
probably by like a 5-year-old.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, but no, a lot of those arcades, it's a blessing and a curse of those online ones, because recently one of the Gundam ones, or I guess one of the shooter Gundam inspired ones, actually just shut down, and there's not really an offline option, so it's really hard for like a secondhand ownership if you want some of these arcades. It's kind of a double-edged sword almost.
Yeah.
See, the thing as well about like what you were talking about, Dave, about what the younger gamers think about arcades, and I think that's the thing that I picked up last night, because also I went to Arcade Club with Dan, but that's primarily an arcade. But this place I went to last night with my mate, NQ64 it's called, and at times I did feel like I was the oldest there, but it's quite interesting watching how they perceive these games, being a lot younger. Like a lot of them were born, whenever like, most of these games were out, and it's quite funny. I think the barcades, I think it's more about them trying to kind of recreate that kind of retro vibe. It's like it's not so much about the games themselves, it's about more the machines. I think that, there was, again, like Mel said, a lot of these there's games there that looked like mobile games, but it seems to be just looking at people playing these games, and even like hearing people kind of laughing or pointing or kind of, oh, look at that now, or things like that. And it's just interesting to see, like, at one point these were like cutting edge. Like they had a 4-player Outrun 2 cabinet. It wasn't the SP, it was just the normal Outrun 2, and that was really popular. But it's like, it was people who you just look at them wondering how they're perceiving them. They're not seeing them the way we did. Like we see
Definitely
them
not.
new and cutting edge. So it's just interesting. Like the barcades, it does seem to be more about trying to recreate the vibe of the past more than actually appreciating the games. Which sounds kind of weird, but it was interesting just watching people kind of taking these games in like a lot younger, and seeing them react to them.
Yeah, like the significance might be completely lost on most folks, like unless you like really grew up. I feel like we were so fortunate to grow up in a time like that, because now games are just games themselves. It's so mainstream, and it's so like when we were gifted each new arcade experience, and it was just this huge treat to find a new arcade cabinet, like Daytona USA. Like the first time you got to sit down and play Daytona USA, it was like nothing. It was nothing you've ever seen, but at the same time, it was just absolute bleeding edge graphics and gameplay. Like it was just the most futuristic thing that you'd ever seen, right? And now it's like, if you look at it and you don't have that kind of like maybe rose tinted glasses that we do, it's just, you just look at it as, well, that's kind of a unimpressive, my son would look at that and he'd be like, well, the Mario Kart arcade game seems more fun than that. I'm like, yes, but you don't understand like how big of a deal this really was, right?
We were getting blown away every other month, it felt like back then, weren't we?
It wasn't just the games themselves, but it was the fact that we got to grow up in a time where we just didn't take things for granted, like every new thing was just like this huge gift from the gaming gods, and we got to play it and experience it and try to fight for a place in line, to get onto a machine and play. And it's like now, arcades have kind of been reduced to these gambling centers, for the most part. I played a really sad arcade game recently. I took Jesse to Dave and Buster's, and they've pretty much gotten rid of all of the old light gun shooters, like the classic Jurassic Park light gun shooters and stuff. And they've replaced them with these really, really short campaign, like brain dead easy versions of the game. So we played a Ghostbusters game, right? And it's literally like 1.5 or 2 levels, right? That's it. And it repeats on loop and it's brain dead easy. I felt like, wow, like a 2-year-old could play this and win, quote unquote win, right? And so I was really surprised when it was over. I was like, oh, it's over? Because they want to get us out of here and have the next people come in and, just keep it going, right? So that was like really sad, because I was like, when I was a kid playing like House of the Dead, you could stand there and pump money into that machine and try to keep going. And it was an experience, But that's the thing, is it was games as an experience, because we didn't just play games in the living room. We played a lot of video games in the arcade. And that's just kind of the way that it was growing up, that with the importance of arcades, they informed everything that would end up coming to the living room,
that thing we were saying about how every time you walked into an arcade, there was something new.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's like the arcade is where you basically seen the future. It was, you knew there was nothing available in the home that was able to match this. So every time you went in and seen a new machine, you maybe would see a game and you would think, could that come to what I've got at home? There was a wee, especially in the Saturn era, like when you knew, because you had like your Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally, that as you were looking around different games like House of the Dead, and then obviously 97, whenever you got Scud Racing, you stupidly and naively go, ooh, that might get a Saturn port, not realizing the shit's hitting the fan at that point. But it was just, that was the exciting part. Like every visit was like opening a door on like an advent calendar. It was like, what are you going to get next? And it was just like, it was the cutting edge, like the arcades, like were the future. Like it wasn't just the game itself, that like, the cabinet formed part of that experience, like especially the deluxe cabinets, like the Jurassic Park, the Lost World, the cabinet for that, if I remember, that was almost like you were sitting in the green and yellow and red Jeep from the film, and again, big screen and the kind of the mounted guns and things like that,
and things shaking and stuff.
It was like almost like an amusement park ride inside this cabinet that was happening. So you knew that what you were seeing, there was a chance you were going to get something like at home. It would be like a version of it, but it wouldn't quite match it.
Right.
And for us back then, that was kind of like almost enough. You accepted the limitations of the hardware you had at home. But it just felt as if, like, the 2D stuff from the 80s into the early 90s, also the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo were doing an admirable job of replicating that. Home computers like the Amiga, Atari ST had mixed results. But then when you went into the kind of the 3D era, as you're saying, like your Virtua Fighter, then you're seeing Daytona USA. Like if you think like Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter 2, like being like kind of 94, 95 kind of games, you think of what you were playing at home in 94 and 95 compared to these things. So that's why it just always felt like every time you went to an arcade, you were just seeing another step being taken, another technological jump being taken. Like they just kept pushing the envelope. And that's what I think. It's a shame now, and it sounds like old man shouting at the cloud, but
right,
like everything's just so standardized. Like, it's like PS5 and Series X are literally the same machine with a different badge on them. Like all your PC stuff, if you line up a PC game, a PS5 game, and a Series X game, and you don't know what they are, they all have very similar kind of looks about them. It's a very standardized set, but back then it was like just everything seemed to be, there was like a new visual effect, or just something that added more cars or more tracks or more characters. Everything just seemed to be ramping up.
Yeah, it's like Dave said. That's what you said, Dave, wasn't it? That we're very privileged in what we got to see that evolution, didn't we? We got to see not just the visual improvements, but the gameplay improvements. Everything was brand new, so you'd have your mind blown every time that you'd visit the arcade.
Like, and a lot of it was Sega stuff. Honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, if it was like these weird, like the what is it, Galaxy Force cabinets, like Sega did a lot of ride-on stuff. They did like the time traveler thing with the hologram. They did all this crazy stuff that was just way out there, and would just blow your mind when you saw it. I do remember like Namco doing that kind of stuff too, to a degree. Like Mel was right about like the Starblade stuff and like the Galaxian theaters that you would go in and play like with like 4 or 6 guns, and it was like $5 or something like that. It was really expensive because it was like a theater. They had that kind of stuff. But you remember like in the 90s, those like Alpine Racer, where you would be like actually racing down the slopes and like moving your feet or Top Skater and stuff like that. Like, you don't have those kind of experiences really anymore. Like, all those machines are beat to hell, right? So they haven't really lasted. And I don't see them doing that anymore in the arcade, or even putting in that kind of effort. We used to have like a bank of bikes for Manx TT. You'd have like 5, 4, maybe 8. It depends on how big the arcade was, but I don't see that at any of the barcades or even Dave and Buster's, any of the big ticket centers. It's really just become this exercise in just getting them to continue to load credits on their card and play for more tickets. And maybe that's because people really don't have to go to the arcades to play good video games anymore, like, because it really has changed completely to where people play games at home, or they play them on their phone. They go to Dave and Buster's, they're going there to get drunk and play some games and walk home with a teddy bear or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think everything pretty much got homogenized. I probably would have to say some of the title boards really homogenized the whole idea in the Lindbergh with PC and arcades. I think that at that point, everything pretty much became a PC light. Like, all the arcade machines, all these other things are pretty much just the PC with a NVIDIA or AMD graphics card inside of the machine. So a lot of that innovation, a lot of that crazy hardware, a lot of the cool innovations kind of were put to the wayside of, oh, hey, these arcades are dying, we need new games for it because we kind of want to support it. So pretty much, that's going to be off topic, but pretty much everything nowadays, console-wise and PC-wise, is going to be homogenized, like James was saying, into one whole thing. They're all just PC lights, essentially, which is a good or a bad thing if you think about it. It helps, make more games and makes more games a little bit more faster, but, that innovation has really gone down with that mentality in mind.
Just seeing the arcade evolve before, right? Like, I agree with you, Dave, in that most of the innovations we saw, or that I saw personally, were Sega. I remember my earliest memories of being in an arcade, and one of my earliest memories is someone had kind of I was away somewhere and someone had like a Binatone, like Space Invaders thing. I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I think that's probably where my obsession with games began. But then shortly after, I went to an arcade and I saw Afterburner, and this was the full gyroscopic version, and that just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And it's from there. We had Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat in the interim, but when Virtua Racing hit, Virtua Fighter. And one of my most poignant memories is seeing the Model 3 in the arcade in 1996 when Virtua Fighter 3, when I was talking about that seaside resort that I went to, and seeing that in person. And that was kind of the tipping point there, where you think, we've moved from, in this short time, we've moved from sprites in 91 to digitized graphics in 92 to polygons in 92, 93. Then we've got texture maps in 94, which, they look great in 3D, but you're not quite photorealistic yet. And then you've got Virtua Fighter 3, and like, oh, there we are. Now we're kind of, they've got the eyes tracking you in the attract mode, and you just think, wow, I mean, this is the pinnacle. And this is 94 to 96. I'm still 96. I'm still playing the Sega Mega Drive. I didn't get my Saturn
Right.
until like later on that year. And you think about the gulf between what you're playing in the home and then what you're seeing in the arcade, and it was just mind blowing. And it is a shame that we don't see that anymore.
Yeah, we reached the Dreamcast era, I think, where I'd walk into some of those casino arcades and see Naomi machines, and I was like, this pretty much looks at like what I have at home, And at that time, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, but I didn't really think that it was like a harbinger of like the end of the arcade, basically. I guess it makes sense that it would be, right? Because I mean, once you reach that kind of parity, like who wants to continue to pump quarters into an arcade machine? The initial D stuff, like Pat mentioned, you'd get a driver's license, and it's an experience, and you really can't do that at home to any meaningful degree, so that kept me coming back to the arcade. And honestly, like, we stopped going to the arcades, or at least speaking for myself, like I stopped going to the arcades for years, and it's only recently that I've started like going back and trying to seek them out, right? But I mean, in a way, like even I turned my back on the arcades because I just didn't need them anymore. But in that time that I stepped away, it just changed so much. And I do feel fortunate that when we were young, we didn't have to seek out arcades. They pretty much found us like wherever we were. If we were waiting for a pizza, we went and played an arcade game. If we were waiting for our frames, because we went with a party of 5 or 6 people who bowl slow, I could run over and play some Space Harrier while I was waiting,
Exactly.
Especially if you suck, you're not going to get very far. And then you can run
honestly,
back and bowl your frames,
Yeah, honestly, the arcades have been replaced with phones essentially. Like, instead of playing an arcade game now, we just look at our phones or play one of those gotcha games or whatever, the ones that people are playing now. I kind of got it. My roommate plays them, but I just don't do the gotcha games or stuff like that. But like I said, it's a lost art, and I kind of think, like Dave said, I noticed especially when the arcades pretty much are 1-to-1 with the consoles. It's like, why pump all those quarters so you just buy a $200 console? It's also a DVD player and play it in the living room,
Yeah.
See, it's like as whenever we had Mel on our show recently, and we could have joked that, Sega's whole aim was to bring the arcade home. And then, like, with Dreamcast, they succeeded. They done it. They brought the arcade home with no compromises in terms of visuals. The Naomi board was birthed off of the Dreamcast, so it was like they just turned around and went, okay, we've done it. That's it. Cool. Let's just go home. That's it. We're finished.
Yeah.
Stop making consoles. Mission achieved. That's it. But the thing is, well, see, a lot of the thing that we've all said is that how, ubiquitous and how prominent Sega were. And even now in these barcades, like, Sega is still the dominant brand. It's their games that still stand that test of time. And I know, obviously, like, the Saturn was my first Sega console, and I wanted that Mega Drive, and, my parents got me an Atari ST, and then I went down the home computer route because of their choice. And it was very much in the arcades where kind of Sega came to being really, really relevant in my life through Virtua Fighter, and then obviously, getting the Saturn via Munko buying one, that UK launch and getting that surprise. But I think that's why I think Sega has such a profound impact on me, and why I've got the opinion of them that I do. It's just because for me, they always were the gold standard in gaming. Like, I know people going about that they don't respect their history enough, and people focus wrongly on the failure of their consoles. But, it's like the arcades, they were an absolute titan. Their name was made there. The consoles were basically trying to bring some version of that home, but it's just that's where.
Why was Sega so good in the arcades?
It's just a thing that it's hard to put a finger on it or find a a definitive
Innovation.
answer.
Innovation.
Yeah.
Didn't they work with like military contractors too? Like, was it like there was a huge push
Model
for
2
like,
boards.
because like simulation, like a lot of arcade games would be birthed out of like, originally these things were designed to be like simulations of real life, right? Driving simulator, flying simulator, VR, 3D, all that stuff was really came from like the military complex, right? But Sega was one of those few that like had the vision to like partner up with the military complex and put it in the arcade as like a form of amusement, right? Which was like,
I mean, they had the giant simulator, the giant flight simulator, and was it Sega World, that one with Michael Jackson hosting it?
Oh,
They
remember that?
Yeah, they had that. They had the actual flight sims where it's like you're going upside down, like the whole gyroscope thing. Like, I mean, Nintendo, PlayStation, I was looking up, just didn't even touch anything like that. Namco, all the other ones. It's like Sega was just like doing crazy stuff like this just because they wanted to have fun with it. And it seems like they were arcade first. Like, I mean, say what we will about Nintendo when they're focused, but like Sega was, I mean, you go to the arcade, you're just seeing Sega. Nintendo might have a machine here or there, Mario Kart or Killer Instinct or something, but you're always going to see a Sega arcade machine there, and I think that's why they were so good. They just made that one of their main focuses, and the console, while it was a focus, it seemed almost like an afterthought in a way. Like they want to take what they did in the arcades and put it on the console, if that makes any sense.
Well, if you really go back through Sega's history, I don't want to go back too far, but Sega was always trying to change your experience in the arcade. If you go back, man, most early arcade games are two-dimensional affairs. Every now and then you'd get some vector graphics. Sega was trying to turn video games 3D as far back as the late 70s with various types of technology that would scale sprites or move the screen forward. You can go back to those old Fonz video games they did, and then there was like the racing games, Monaco, and games like that. And then you would go to like their Buck Rogers game in the arcade. And then, of course, all of that technology eventually gave way to sprite scaling. And dude, think about this for a second. Sega works on sprite scaling throughout the late 70s into the 80s, comes out with super scalers. When was there a home console that was actually capable of recreating that sprite scaling experience? I mean,
Saturn.
Even the Saturn, I think would have trouble doing some of the more powerful boards. I mean, could the Saturn have done something like Outrunners 1-to-1?
No.
Much more complicated game on the System 32. But basically what I'm saying is this technology is from the mid 80s, and we have to get into the mid 90s before there was even a home console that could do it. And then you look at their Model 1, Model 2 stuff. Really, what it was the Dreamcast. You're talking 5 years later, 6 years later, before there was even a home console capable of outperforming that.
Oh yeah.
And that's what made Sega so incredible. Not only were they giving you these like incredible sit down experiences and mechanical experiences with the cabinets themselves, but they were trying to change how you played your video games. They just didn't pump out countless 2D games or try to copy somebody else's fighting game at the time. They were always trying to make something play new, and that's exactly why Sega was so special. And in a way, if they had tried to do that with their home consoles, you have to wonder, would they have been more successful? If the Sega Genesis had been able to scale sprites so some of those games could have come home earlier, would it have made a difference? If the Saturn had been able to do better polygon performance, would it have lost to the PlayStation with the games that played as well as they did? Sega was always caught in between this incredible amount of innovation in the arcade and not being able to quite bring it home at that same level. You know, not that the games didn't
despite
play
always
well,
trying, right? But yeah,
right. They tried, but they were always caught as kind of almost a half measure.
Right.
We're going to put this Motorola 68,000 in the Genesis, but strip away all the sprite scaling.
Okay, but you just made a brilliant point. It was all down to cost, right? Though, because they could only afford to put so much in the living room, right? They could only afford to build a console, much less get consumers to buy it, right? And that is a huge nail on the head kind of thing. Arcade machines back then were like the cost of a small car, right? You know, like arcade machines back then were, not only were they hugely expensive, but they were like cutting edge technology that you weren't going to find anywhere else for years. Like you said, like it would take a decade to catch up to it. It was that advanced. Whereas now, like Pat's saying, the arcade games that you go and play nowadays are just cheap PCs, right? It's like literally, it's almost like off the shelf old parts, old technology, really, like nothing that's going to blow you away. Whereas like the difference is back then you were looking at the literal most cutting edge technology and that wouldn't even be, you know, duplicated for like a decade in the living room. And it really came down to cost. And you're right, Mel, it was a half measure. But I suppose there really was, because of the money thing, you know, there was only ever so much they could do.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily always been the case, though, because their competition was able to do it. The PlayStation was easier to program for and had better polygon capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
When you go back and you look at the Super Nintendo, Nintendo found a way to get scaling, although it wasn't the same technology. It was still able to create a similar feeling. And these are areas where Sega kind of failed to transition. They failed to transition this upper level technology of their arcade. They failed to find an affordable way to get it in their consoles, whereas their competition tended to be able to find a way to get it into their consoles. And, you know, so Sega never lost the gameplay magic. They always had that, but they always seemed to be, you know, sort of upended by a competitor that would come along and do something just a little bit better to grab the attention at home with the console, you know, the console market. And I don't know, I think maybe because Sega was always trying to push to come out before, or their machines were always kind of off target as to when the competitor's machine would come out. I don't know if there was a timing thing there that would probably explain this as to why Sega struggled so much, but I don't know. It always seemed at home, when it came to a console, Sega was always just a step behind the competition, especially when you separate it regionally, you know, because their machines came out at different times regionally. Different machines had different levels of success, and their competition didn't seem to have this trouble. Their competition seemed to be able to deal with this so much more effectively. I mean, think about it for a second. Nintendo's looking at arcades and they're going, what do we put in our Super Nintendo that's going, you know, going to make people's eyes pop and go, ooh, this is different. They looked at what Sega was doing in the arcade, man.
Right.
And they're basically saying, oh, creating a VDP that's going to scale sprites, that's going to be too expensive. Oh, let's just scale a background plane that we can make the whole level come at you instead of using sprites to do it. I mean, you telling me Sega couldn't think of that?
Right.
I mean,
yeah, it just seems that Sega just gave their competition just time to cook. I mean, between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo was a 2-year gap.
Yeah.
I mean, you have something with like the PlayStation 2 specifically. There was another year gap between that, or 2-year gaps if you think about from the Japanese release, or you know, the Saturn I think came out a little bit earlier than the PlayStation 1, right? Or did they come out at the same time?
No,
I
they
can't
Around
remember.
about the same time.
they
2
came
weeks
out the same
apart.
time.
Yeah, and they were developed
I
simultaneously.
can remember. Yeah, but yeah, like I said, it seems like Sega just really gave their competition time to cook and really expand upon it. So where the console you're getting is technically in a more advanced system, even if it's just a little bit later released, or you know, just different opportunities that were handed to them. You know.
Well, tech companies often say you don't want to be the first to market. You know,
Exactly.
you want to use the playbook and then do it better, right? Because it's always the first one to market is usually the one who gets a good pat on the back, you know, for showing us all the way, right? And then somebody else swoops in and ends up being like they end up making it an IP. You know, like,
it was always Sega, wasn't it? Sega always wanted to be first, but that's
right.
a brilliant point from Mel, and it ties into, because at the moment I'm just doing something around the SG-1000, and that was a system that, you know, it was Sega's first system, obviously, and that had a number of arcade ports in its launch lineup, and in that arcade launch lineup, you've got, you know, you've got games like Starjackers, but you've also got games like Congo Bongo. Now, Congo Bongo in the arcade at the time is an absolutely stunning. I know we're talking about the 80s there rather than the 90s, but it's an absolutely gorgeous arcade game. You know, this gorgeous, bright, isometric game, which, you know, at its base level, you're chasing the monkey, which sounds a little bit like Donkey Kong. When it comes home, it's this flat, kind of dull looking, you know, you only got 2 colors per sprite. It looks nothing like the arcade. Still, I think it's still an enjoyable game. You contrast that with what came out day and date with that in Japan, which was the Famicom, which has Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye on it. 3 games, you look at them compared to Congo Bongo, they're not on the same playing field in the arcade visually, but in the home, they were almost made for the NES or the Famicom. You know, Nintendo kind of focused on bringing those particular games to the home intact, and the gameplay's intact. And, you know, it's kind of, if you squint, they do look like the arcade, unlike the games that were on the Famicom. And that kind of followed, it's like you said, Mel, it followed Sega through. They had the Mark III, but the PC Engine came out a year later, and you compare the versions of like Space Harrier, for example, on those 2 systems, and other stuff that the PC Engine had that was like that. I can't remember the name of the game. I've got it on the shelf somewhere. You play like a samurai who's going through Space Harrier style. It just shows, again, the gulf in capabilities. This Mega Drive, 2 years before the Super Nintendo, again, the Super Nintendo had the scaling. So yeah, it's Sega's arcade games kind of were always playing catch up, and I know they wanted to bring the arcade home, and that was their kind of raison d'etre for their home consoles. But you do feel that, I don't know where the gap was, but if there was maybe a little bit more time, a little bit more focus, they could have been so much more successful in bringing that experience home than they actually were, as great as a lot of those arcade ports were.
But as an arcade amusement company at their core, like, one thing that they would do, they would spare no expense when it came to arcade cabs. Like, they would put every last dime into like making them the best experience, and that would create a harder target to hit when it comes to bringing it home. You know, Nintendo would always kind of focus on creating you know, an experience that would be able to be replicated, you know, either if they're taking it, you know, from the console to the Game Boy, right? They did this thing where they were like, okay, we're going to use this really like kind of underpowered hardware, but we're going to create an experience that's so easy to just boil it down to like a Game Boy experience, and it'll sell like hotcakes, you know. And Sega, there was this greater gap between like them spending just every last penny on their arcade stuff and making it the best ever, and then it's like, well, how do we do that? I think Mel's right. You know, they could have hit on Mode 7, but Nintendo did it first.
Well, you have to really think about that too. Was that the fundamental flaw in Sega, its entire console run? If they were at heart an arcade company, and they were all about bleeding edge technology, shouldn't that have translated to a home strategy that said, let's look at what the competition is doing and then beat them by incorporating something from our arcade technology, no matter how pared down it may have been to meet cost, to beat them? Go and look at the Genesis. The Genesis or the Mega Drive was built to compete with the NES. Not the Super Nintendo. True. But if you go back and you look at gaming magazines, everyone knew that the Super Nintendo was going to be capable of, I don't know if they called it Mode 7 in those early days, right? But even like a year and a half before the Super Nintendo launches, everyone knows the Super Nintendo is going to scale because that's what Nintendo is showing off at the trade shows. Those tech demos eventually became Pilot Wings and F-Zero and stuff like that. The fact of the matter is that no matter how you look at it, Sega, their home market should have played off of, let's wait until we can give these people what they want before we put the system on the market. But instead, the console market sort of deviated on its own trajectory where it was like, we're just going to do our own thing. And I'm not sure that translated well because all of Sega's innovation was in the arcade and their home machines were very rarely able to bring that same level of experience.
Right.
You know, even when you look at the Saturn, man, when you look at something that plays as good as Sega Rally or Virtua Fighter 2, there's a whole lot of other Model 2 games that still didn't come off at the same level because the Saturn just couldn't do them. And then what happened just a few years after the Saturn comes out? The freaking Model 3 hits. And of course, then everything Sega does in the arcade is completely out of touch. You know, the Saturn is never going to be able to replicate any of that stuff. I mean, not even close.
It's true.
So I think, you know, fundamentally, if you look at Sega's strategy, their home strategy should have been tied to the arcade in sort of a, when we can make it, you know, affordable and we can, you know, replicate it at an acceptable level, then we release a system instead of reacting knee-jerkly, not a word, but you know what I mean?
Sure.
You know, to their competition. You know, the 32X came about because of the Jaguar, for God's sakes. The Jaguar, man. Sega was afraid of the Jaguar taking market, you know, share. Are you freaking kidding me, man? Like
it seems like they thought, oh, maybe these add-ons would be able to keep us afloat and compete with these consoles, but it's like, no, not even close.
But I mean, Dreamcast sounds like what you're talking about. It sounds like they finally hit on something with Dreamcast where they did have true parity, you know, in the arcade and in the home, you know, and they were using.
But at that point, I think that's the market kind of deviated, though.
Exactly. So yeah, no, it took them that long to get to that point where they were, and yeah, like you said, even then it was too late for them. But I mean,
but you know, if you look at it though, think about it. If Sega had been healthy, the Dreamcast would have been a successful system.
Sure.
I mean, there's no two ways about it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have mattered if the PlayStation 2 had outsold it.
Right.
Sega still would have had a successful system.
It would have stayed in the game, yeah.
Right. The only reason the Dreamcast failed is because Sega was already screwed, man. You know, the company, basically, you go back and you look at it, Sega's pretty much screwed 97 on. You know, the company is in the red. You know, you've got, you know, freaking executives having to forgive personal debt just to keep the company out of bankruptcy. I mean, the Dreamcast had no shot. I mean, I don't care how you look at it. You go back, the Dreamcast never had a shot. But you're right. At that time, Sega finally was kind of on that path where they were like, we have a home system that's going to be able to do the arcade. Here's our innovation. Here's our chance. But there was nothing left of the company to make it happen.
Right. And you look at the development and the architecture of the Dreamcast, it sounds like what you're talking about. It sounds like they're finally putting everything they have into making this console, this home console, innovative and cutting edge, right? You're right. While the Model 2 and Model 3 were innovative as hell, the Saturn is really just, let's put a bunch of chips together and try to make this happen. Let's try to make this work and get it done, you know? And I mean, as much as I love the Saturn, I'm not going to lie and say that that architecture right there is innovative. You know, it really was just, you know, trying to scrap together a system that could, you know, do more than they originally planned because they were caught wind of what Sony was doing, you know?
Yeah. And I think that if Sega was in a healthy position, I think Dreamcast would have been successful, or it'll still be a successful console. And there's a prime example of that Nintendo. I mean, they did back-to-back flops with the N64 and the GameCube, and that company obviously is still around and making consoles. Well, I mean, still making consoles in the game. So I do agree that even if the Dreamcast was the way it is, or was a little bit least successful, I think Sega would still be in that console market if they were in a healthier position.
The thing about the Dreamcast as well is that all through the rumors, the build up, everything was all about the Dreamcast being Model 3 in the home. Like Sega Saturn magazine doing previews, Edge doing previews. Everything was all about, even interviews with like like Hideki Sato and other Sega executives and supplements that came with Edge magazine. It was all about Model 3 in the home. And we kind of know that obviously Dreamcast didn't quite hit Model 3 in terms, like you look at VF3TB, I love it, but there's compromises there. Sega Rally 2, more or less like a glorified PC port because of Windows CE. Virtual On Oratorio Tangram is probably the most impressive of the Model 3 stuff, but it's quite interesting we're talking about, how Sega were, if they had tried to pair the arcade kind of philosophy with the home, would it have helped them? But it's quite kind of telling that the Dreamcast was pushed as being Model 3 in the home, but then the Dreamcast birthed Naomi, which would go on to then, provide the majority of the Dreamcast arcade ports. So it's like the whole thing was about, trying to take the arcade technology and pare it down to console, but they kind of got the console to such a point where they decided to take the schematics basically in the blueprint from the console to make an arcade board to then feed back to the console. It was like
it's just cheaper. It's just cheaper economic wise to do that versus, hey, why develop all these different platforms? We can take this one platform of what we're doing for Dreamcast and break it off into an arcade and just port them easily. Yeah.
Aye.
Like it just makes sense cost wise.
Yeah.
Naomi is looked upon as being the successor to Model 3, but it's based on the Dreamcast.
Right.
And even the Chihiro board as well. It's basically a souped up original Xbox as well. It's like
And the Naomi platform lasted for a while as well because they had the triangle systems and all that other stuff and the Thomas Wave stuff, and it was all basically Dreamcast architecture.
True, because we got a Thomas Wave compatibility now on the Dreamcast. You're right, and so that maybe was that the beginning of like the whole homogenization of the arcades. Like basically everything is just essentially like a PC under the hood.
Pretty much. I mean, that's what it costs to keep it alive at that point because it's once you got 1-to-1, it's like why do we have to keep making these boards that are extremely expensive when we can just make one platform and switch up a little bit or use a PC to do that. And arcades were already suffering at that time, especially with the home console rise. So it's like, well, why do we suppose all this money that's going to get us little sales to these arcades when we can just take this platform and, make as much money as possible? So it's just a weird symptom.
Like you said before, going to the arcade became more about unique experiences than experiencing the best in technology and the best that graphics could offer.
Yeah, it's why these rhythm game stuff are so popular nowadays. I mean, that's why everything's unique. It's like, why do we want to do a port of this when we just go home and play,
Well, you have a rhythm game at home, right?
Yeah, Sound Voltex Exceed Gear, baby.
Yeah.
That's why we give Sega a lot of credit as well, because we've spoken about how the machines that they made, the cabinets were part of the experience. They kind of enhanced the gameplay. But in a lot of ways, most of the time, Sega somehow managed, no matter how stripped down the game was on the hardware it was being brought down to, they still brought that feeling. So they could somehow, like with Daytona USA, the original Daytona port on Saturn, you've taken away that, amazing cabinet, the steering wheel, the force feedback, but somehow under your thumb on a D-pad, you're still getting the power drifting. It still feels, you can still hook into that feeling, that vibe, that gameplay, that hook is still there. And again, even without the cabinet, they still managed to do that. And if it was maybe beyond the control, like Virtual On Saturn, we'll make a specialist peripheral. We'll give you the twin sticks. We'll give you a means there. Manx TT, okay, we've taken away the bike that you lean side to side. We'll put in 3D analog controller support, and we'll let you lean the bike left and right and hold your turns. You know, so they still found a way to bring the best version of that experience into the home while stripping away the cabinet aspect of it, which I always think is really clever. Like that they actually still managed to just nail the feel of the gameplay even without the big, you know, the bells and whistles of the cabinet.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, speaking of Sega and speaking of the arcade, I want to do something. I want to go around the room. We'll start with Mel, and I want you guys to list off the most special Sega arcade games, okay? And it'll be kind of a quick fire thing, and we can go a couple rounds, but that way everybody gets to name one of their favorites, okay? So, like, if someone asked you, what are the best Sega arcade games and why were they so good? What would you say, Mel? Like, what would be at the top of your list in terms of arcade?
I mean, are we talking just overall favorite or most impressive technically?
Let's say like having the most impact, like the pinnacle of importance to the arcade overall. Like, what do you think are the most shining examples of Sega's arcade games? So if it's something from the 80s, I don't care. That's fine. It qualifies.
In that case, I'd have to choose the first Outrun. I mean, I can still remember, you know, it's what, 86 that came out. So I would have seen it at some point in late 86, early 87. You know, you have to think back to what arcade games looked like back then, man. They were still pretty simple, you know, and then you roll up into an arcade and there is Outrun, and it's this forward scrolling, lots of color on screen, lots of things whizzing by, coming at you at this super smooth performance, and it plays so well. But it's not your typical racing game where, you know, you're racing other cars. It's kind of, you're just sort of racing against yourself, trying not to, you know, mess up in the environment. There was a sort of zen relaxation to Outrun, and it looked so different from the other games. Even if you compare it to other super scalers, go back and put that next to something like Hang On from the year before, and Outrun is so much more visually impressive, you know? And it was just one of those games that it hit you when you walked into an arcade in the mid 80s that Sega was trying to give you something different. They were trying to give you something that not just had the technology above the competitors, but also gameplay wise. Name me another racing game in 86, 87 that was at that level. Just this almost, I mean, you felt like the steering wheel felt like what a car would feel like, you know, and back then that's saying something, because those games weren't simulations, but this was close to the feel, you know, in terms of, you know, going around corners and stuff. You'd have to brake, you'd have to shift gears. Oh man, that sharp, you know, corners coming up, I have to downshift because braking isn't gonna be enough to get me to survive around that. There was that extra layer of gameplay in Outrun that just showed you that Sega was trying to give you more than just some dumbass plumber climbing up a ladder and trying to save his girlfriend, you know?
Was that the sit down?
Oh yeah.
And it was that, so like was there anything special about the cabinet itself that you remember?
Well, the one that we had, man, it was basic. It was just the sit down unit. I wouldn't see the one that actually moved until many years later, but it was just, you know, the Outrun experience was graphics, gameplay, music. The cabinet then wasn't anything special by Sega standards, but you know, it was still pretty good, you know, overall when you look at it. But I'd pick Outrun.
Awesome. That's a great first choice. What about you, James?
I'm going straight in this. The minute you said the question, I had my answer already. It's the first Virtua Fighter. Both kind of personally and from an industry perspective. Personally wise, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I wouldn't be on a Sega podcast. I wouldn't be playing Sega games and have that reverence for them without Virtua Fighter. I wouldn't have got a Saturn if it wasn't for Virtua Fighter. My uncle bought that one because he took me to the arcades to play Virtua Fighter, so he obviously must have knew it was on there, and that's why he got it. So that game is just so entrenched in my memory. So yeah, that was an easy choice. Just again playing that big deluxe sit down 50-inch rear projection screen arcade machine. Even if I did only get to play like a couple of pounds worth every weekend, it was just an experience that just stuck with me. I'm going home and playing, as I said, on like a home computer, 16-bit home computer, and there was nothing like it in terms of the depth of it, the animation, everything about it was just, it felt so far ahead. Yeah.
And it didn't matter that they were blocky either, because when we saw that, it's like, because
we had faces and individual fingers.
Yeah, we hadn't seen actual humans moving in 3D before that. So it just completely blew our minds, right? I mean, we had seen Virtua Racing, right? But when you saw Virtua Fighter, you were like, okay, a fighting game with characters like people, and they have the, you know, crazy kicks and moon jumps, and all of it is in 60 frames per second. Yeah, that was an incredible moment. Yeah. So your first machine that you ever saw was the one with the huge projection? Oh, okay, wow.
And Booths, it was a big one with the kind of the bench, so the plastic bench that you sat on, and also the big kind of the column, or the big panel with the controls on it, and this big screen with the logo above it. And obviously Virtua Fighter, you know, has a profound impact on so many aspects of the industry. It made Sony sit up and take notice and change course on the design of the PlayStation. How many people, you know, in the industry have cited Virtua Fighter as an inspiration, like John Carmack, you know, citing Virtua Fighter as an inspiration. So yeah, it's a game that I think, again, people wrongly look at it, and again, they hear Virtua Fighter, and one of the first things that you'll hear people say is, oh, the Saturn port was a bit shit and they had to make Virtua Fighter Remix to make amends for it. And it's like, no, it's like, that's not what Virtua Fighter is. It's like, and even as much as the Saturn port, you know, as I said, like you see that intro with Akira, and you know, his fingers, he's got individual blocky fingers,
right,
but in the Saturn, he's just got bunched up kind of fists. So they're not actually. But whenever I seen that running in the home, like in my mind's eye, there was no difference. Obviously now you can see it, but as a 15, 16-year-old kid back then, just having played that at weekends, to finally have that in your house, that felt like such a massive technological achievement, to have something like that in the home. So again, it's just a title that's had such an impact on me personally that I said I wouldn't be sitting here, I wouldn't have got a Saturn, I wouldn't be the Sega-holic without Virtua Fighter. So that's my choice.
Nice.
Yeah, it's an impossible question to pick one, Dave, isn't it?
Well, don't pick one.
No, I'll pick one.
Okay.
Because I had a few floating around my head, and I think the one that I'm going to have to go to will have to be Afterburner for a variety of reasons. And it is a mix of, you know, I said earlier when we were in the discussion that it was one of the very first arcade games that I saw, and seeing it was kind of transformative. It absolutely blew me away. And if you put into context where it came, it was almost the perfect game for the perfect time. If you go back to 1987, you're a year removed from Top Gun, which, you know, if you're playing on like Commodore 64 or, you know, Spectrum or whatever, the market's already been flooded with a bunch of similar games that have been, you know, behind the plane and stuff, but nothing looks quite like this. You know, and Mel, you talked about, you know, Outrun being this Zen game, which it is. It's a beautiful, chill game when you're just cruising along. But Afterburner is this, you know, just rip-roaring white knuckle game, and especially if you get into that deluxe cab and you pull the throttle up, you know, because you control your throttle, which is unlike any other sort of game before it, to see how fast you can fly it. And it is the very, you know, it's just a thrill playing it. It's another game that took, you know, even when the 32X had a port, that couldn't match the resolution or the frame rate on it. Even the Saturn port isn't quite arcade perfect. It's just, as a game, it's fantastic, and as a piece of technology, it was just a quantum leap beyond, you know, even the superscalers that came before it. And I think it's still a game that holds up. It's a game its footprint in the industry is massive. You look at games like Star Fox wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Afterburner. Even if you play Star Fox on even the original one on the SNES, it takes so much. Even some of the music sounds a little bit like Afterburner. And I think that for those reasons, for me personally, it's similar to James. It's one of the first arcade Sega games that I saw, and I was in love with it instantly. So for me, it holds a huge personal weight. But as a piece of technology and piece of game software itself, it's another one that also helps shape the industry going forward. So yeah, I'd have to say by a hair. There's so many others, but Afterburner probably for me is the one.
I'll come around to you a second time, so you can be thinking about your second choice right now.
It depends if you or Pat say them.
Go ahead, Pat. What do you got?
So this one is kind of tricky. I'm just gonna have to go say an entire board. Probably the Naomi arcade board, in my opinion, is the pinnacle of what Sega was trying to achieve with the arcade games. You had games that nowadays are iconic to the point where they're still played, and there's no like upgrading, upscaling needed. It's just like good as is, like MVC2. Like that's probably one of the ones that are probably the most renowned. Like everybody knows it. Go to the arcade. They played it at Evo years and years later. It's a game that's revolutionized the arcades, and that board is just home to just so many games that are so iconic. House of the Dead 2, Super Monkey Ball, Rhythm Heaven, just so many games. Initial D arcade, where it started out there. There are just so many iconic games that came from that board that it's just ridiculous. Like I can't even name them off. Games that are still made to this day that are based off the games that are on that board. And to me, I think
Easy Taxi.
Exactly.
Right?
Crazy Taxi as well. I can't believe I forgot about that. It didn't come up on my pod. But yeah, there's just so many iconic games.
Yeah.
That's like you think of Sega when you say them, and a lot of these are on Naomi. So it's like just to me, the Naomi is honestly, in my opinion, the best of Sega's arcades and the most innovative and memorable.
Okay, so what's your favorite Naomi game then? Like what was your favorite cabinet in the arcade that used that board?
House of the Dead 2. If I had to pick one, House of the Dead 2.
Good choice.
Just because it was probably, I think it was, in my opinion, I think it was a bit better than House of the Dead 1. I thought the story and the branching pathways are good. I mean, story, quotation marks, but it had so much replayability. I really like the boss battle of the Emperor is one of my favorite fights in all of video games. I think it's insanely crazy, insanely difficult, and some of the best of arcade games I could ever experience. So if I had to pick one of the Naomi, that's the most like that I think to me is iconic, and one of the best is House of the Dead 2.
And it's got those stereo speakers cranked up.
Exactly.
Just pounding. The gunfire. Yeah, it's like nothing else, right?
Exactly.
So I'm going to go with the Model 2 board, but a specific game. Like, no arcade game had as much of an impact on me as Daytona USA. Because I'd been floored by arcades before, you know, be it like Mortal Kombat or be it even Virtua Fighter, like James said. But when I saw Daytona USA for the first time, that felt like the most premium thing. Like as a kid, like I couldn't even afford to play it, like, you know, because it was like $1.25 or maybe like $1.50. But back then,
those games are so expensive.
You know, I hardly had any money, right? You know, so it was like, but I would watch grown men who had jobs just pump dollars into that machine and get so good at it, and I would just stand behind their chair and just kind of like watch them play. And it was just the most amazing thing to a kid like me. Like Daytona USA was just this game that was just larger than life. Like it was 4 machines, you know, all networked together in harmony. And it was 60 frames per second. It was texture mapped polygons. Like I had never seen that before. It looked realistic. Like I know now it sounds silly to say that it looked realistic, but back then it was just like, oh my God, this looks like the best thing I've ever seen.
Smooth at 60 frames per second. Just how great it looked. It's unbelievable. I can't blame you.
When I finally got to get behind the wheel too, it's like I didn't even do very well, but just this feeling of exhilaration with the soundtrack, you know, blasting. And Daytona USA felt like a very premium game that I was really privileged to get to play because it was just like so well made. And I actually did go to a place once where they had like 8 cabinets hooked up together. It was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Daytona cabs all networked together, and they were like the larger cockpits. It was just insane. and that was like at a family fun center. I think it was at the Hilton Fun Center. But yeah, so that I would have to say Daytona USA, because that's also the game that I ended up seeking out on the Saturn that really like forced me to get into a Saturn. Okay, so what other game do you think is like iconic Sega? Like if somebody wanted a Sega arcade experience, they would have to play this game. What do you think?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I would choose Outrun 2.
Outrun 2.
Outrun 2, man. Because let's be honest here. Super Scalers started a lot of Sega love out there, especially for me. Outrun 2 kind of ended Sega's arcade run in its traditional sense, didn't it? It was like Sega had this huge rise through the 80s, through the 90s. Then things start to drop off. You start to see their teams get broken up. AM1, AM2, AM3. The creators of these games start to leave Sega. And you get up to a point where Outrun 2 was really the last of traditional Sega kind of being made. It was like the last hurrah of, you know, what Sega was before it became Sammyized and, you know, became this whole entirely different company. And Outrun 2 was just so incredibly special. It was like the people involved in that project just came together and you said, you know what? Let's make the best looking, best playing racing game that we've ever done. And Outrun 2 was really that game. I mean, nothing plays like Outrun 2. At that time, nothing looked like Outrun 2, even on home consoles that really could have done it because the technology was so similar. You know, look at the Xbox, for example. But the fact of the matter is that when you saw that in the arcade and you sat down and played it, it was almost like somebody zapped 20 years of Sega arcade goodness, the feel of everything from the first Outrun to Daytona to Scud Race to, you know, every good game you could think of. You got these feelings when you sat in that cabinet and you jerked that wheel the first time and felt that power slide kick in, man. You've never felt a power slide feel so natural. It's almost like Sega built, you know, they bent the laws of physics
right
to make this should have been the way life should have been, you know. And that's you get up from an Outrun 2 play, man, and you're just like walking away from it like, good God, that was the best thing I've ever experienced in my entire freaking life. And you turned around and you wanted to play it again.
Yeah.
And man, Outrun 2, I don't know, man. When you look at Sega as they come to an end of what they originally were, Outrun 2 was like the pinnacle of their work. I mean, just the best playing racing game I think I've ever played in terms of mechanics and feel.
And then you had SP and Coast to Coast, you know, like,
oh yeah, you had those spinoffs,
right? So do you think Outrun 2 trumps Outrun?
I do.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
I think if you look at it just in terms of raw fun factor and mechanics, yeah, it does. Yeah. I think you have to have a special connection with the original Outrun. Yeah, you have to look at it as a time and place. Like if you walked into an arcade in 86, it was like, wow, Outrun, and then you'd appreciate it. Right. But if you had those two machines sitting side by side today, and you lined up 1,000 people, it'd be real, man. Like 999 people they're gonna choose Outrun 2, you know?
Right. Well, that's awesome that they were able to replicate and even do better, you know, like that's rare that lightning strikes twice, you know, but you're absolutely right. Outrun 2 is phenomenal. What do you think, James? Do you got anything to come after that?
Just before that, I give another choice. I mean, Mel, that was absolutely spot on. See that again, Dan and I had multiple versus races at Arcade Club, and you know, it was just like once you sit at that cabinet it's like there's a magnet on your arse and you can't get up, man. It's like this thing, it just sucks you back. It's like one more shot, and everything you said about it there is spot on. Like the force feedback, the power sliding. You know yourself, you come off the gas, slam the brake, fire the wheel round, back on the gas, and then you're left and right in it, you're fighting it around the bends, and then you've got to fire it back round the other way because you've got those kind of just gameplay wise, it's absolute perfection. So superb.
When we went to Arcade Club, wasn't it, James? If there was one game that everyone wanted to play, it was Outrun 2. We went to visit the machine. They had a bank of 4 of them.
Yeah.
And we went to get to the machines about 10 times, didn't we? And the queue was astronomical. And then when we finally got there at the end, and we've both played Outrun 2 to death, you know, I've got various ports on, you know, I've got the online arcade on 360, I've got the original Xbox 4, I've got Coast to Coast, but nothing is like playing it in the arcade. And me and James both went on there. I think we wanted to go one shot, you know, we'd gone around all the other games, hadn't we? Sat down, you know, we'll have a race. We got to the end and we just looked at each other and went, again?
Aye.
And then that happened about 20 times. We couldn't get off it. It's just absolute. And Mel, that was perfect summation of it there. It is almost Sega it is pretty much Sega at their absolute peak, you know, and it does kind of dovetail into the end of traditional Sega, but as you so eloquently said, Mel, before they were samuraiized, you know, but it's like the absolute peak, and it is, if that was the way that they were going to bow out of their, you know, traditional Sega sense, it's pretty much perfect. Yeah,
right. So I think everybody was probably sitting going, right, he's going to go for Sega Rally, but I'm not.
Really?
I'm actually, I'm going to go. You said if you have to tell somebody to play one Sega game, right? I'm thinking I'm going for what, in my opinion, is the best game on Dreamcast. The game that embodies the spirit of the Dreamcast. It is Crazy Taxi.
Time to make some crazy money. hey.
You know,
yeah.
It's just, again, there's just something so, you know, based about Crazy Taxi, the era that it's set in, the brands that are there, that are, you know, the music, the soundtrack is legendary, but it's got that insanely brilliant Sega thing where you can go on it and you can have fun with it, but if you learn the map, if you start to learn which, you know, passengers you need to map out your lap around the city, you know, it takes on a whole different depth. You know, your different special moves on it. People go, how do you get special moves on a taxi? But, you know, the crazy dash, the crazy through, you know, limit cuts, all these things, you string all those together to get that cab up to full speed. Because even, again, at NQ64 last night, like, people were playing it, and they were going quite slow, but even I clocked a few people looking, because I know how to limit cut. I was managing to get, you know, off brake onto gas and kind of reverse and drive and fire it forward and get those kind of boosts, and you can build up your speed. But it's so deep, so in Crazy Taxi. The gameplay on it is just so rewarding. I was having a laugh last night because whenever my mate was playing it, I was telling him who to pick up, and I was going, he's going to go to the baseball stadium, he's going to go to the heliport, and he looked at me and he says, "You've played this too much." He's like, "You've played this far too much." But it's just, I think it just embodies the Dreamcast perfectly. It's fun. You can have, you know, a 5-10 minute blast with it, pick it up, brilliant. But if you learn your way around it, it's just, there's so much to it. Like, I can go on a quick shot of Crazy Taxi and I could be on it for like an hour. If I get a good run, I can be on it for an hour. And just, it's one of those games, again, the contrast, the bright colours, like the yellow of the cabs, the blue skies of Sega. Everything about it is just, it just screams, you know, Dreamcast, Sega Arcade. It's just a beautiful combination.
And who makes a game like that anyway? About like taxis, you know, driving crazy. But I mean, you know, Sega, like, it's that innovation, right? To do crazy stuff with video games. And like, when I first saw that, I thought it was the craziest thing ever. But when I sat down to it, I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun. Who would have thought, you know?
But
Yeah, who would have thought
who
that
would have thought to
the
make
the
a game about
craziness of
ambulances?
California drivers would have inspired such a great game?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but who would have thought you'd have made a Sega arcade game? Who'd have thought there'd be an arcade game about ambulances?
Right.
I mean, I just
Oh,
say call
trip.
ambulance. Who else makes that?
Yeah.
And that's possibly the darkest, most macabre arcade game ever.
Right.
Like you've got your patient up in the top corner, literally dying because you're hitting things. It's like your patient's bleeding out. They're bleeding out. It's like it's like
Leave it to Sega.
I want a
Mel
Crazy
said,
Taxi ambulance game.
yeah. But Mel said you walk off of an Outrun 2 cabinet, feeling, oh, that was amazing.
Hmm.
If you walk off an emergency call ambulance cabinet, you must be depressed. You just killed somebody. It's like
I never
oh,
thought
okay.
about it that much.
It's dark.
What about you, Dan?
So the next one that I wanted to talk about was Virtua Cop because, and again, it's one of these ones where I think these days I don't think it's given the kind of the recognition for what it did, what it did for not just the genre but the industry. When you think about, the Model 2 board had just come out, and we'd had Virtua Fighter the year earlier, 93. We'd had Daytona USA, but we hadn't had anything really like this because I think the game that was the most popular light gun game before this was Lethal Enforcers, and you look at that, and it's got the digitized sprites, and in the arcade it looks okay, but it's still very much a gallery shooter, like Operation Wolf, just sliding along and taking out the enemies. You had sprite scaling shooters like Line of Fire, which Sega did, and you had Operation Thunderbolt, but Virtua Cop was just completely on a different several levels above everything else they did. Not only did it build on what Virtua Fighter did, one of the things that people forget about with Virtua Fighter and that we try and point out is that that was the first time that 3D character models had been rendered and animated in that way. And Virtua Cop builds on that with the way that you can shoot an enemy, you shoot them in the hand, they clutch the hand, you shoot them in the leg, and you're not moving from side to side, but you're kind of, it's almost like a first person shooter in a way because you're moving through the environment. There's a very cinematic feel to it, and it does so much. I talk about it being like a first person shooter. The only first person shooters we had then were Doom, and they were nothing like that. And that's why Virtua Cop is, it inspired GoldenEye. GoldenEye was initially meant to be a Virtua Cop clone, until Rare couldn't get a light gun peripheral and they couldn't get the aiming to work as much as they'd liked on the N64 pad. And Virtua Cop is just one of those games that just succeeds on every level, It's from a gameplay perspective, it just took that genre and just brought it in a completely new and fresh direction. It's visually impressive, it was one of those standout Model 2 games at the time. But it's also got that Sega hook, hasn't it? Because, you can play through it as much as you can, or you can try and one credit complete it. But then there's that scoring system again. It's kind of like Outrun in that way. Outrun 2 especially has got a very in-depth scoring system when you get into it. The same is true of Virtua Cop, with the way that when you land certain shots and the way that you progress through stages and the way that you top your score up, it's got that Sega hook. So for me, Virtua Cop is a game that just basically does everything. It's quintessentially Sega. It's still, as much as you are this virtual law enforcer capping bad guys, you still got the blue skies. It's still got that Sega vibe to it. It's still got the Sega gameplay hook, but it just refreshed and revitalized the genre and brought the industry in a whole new direction just from what that single game did.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great pick. What about you, Pat? What's your second pick?
I know you're doing a lot of older games, but I actually want to bring up a newer game in the arcade. So maybe probably something like Chunitham or Project Diva, or maybe some of the Initial D racing games are probably one of my picks. I don't know between the three, but the idea is I think that Sega's still got a lot of really fun arcade experiences, especially with rhythm games. And I think Chunitham itself is pretty innovative and interesting compared to stuff like, Beatmania or something where it's actually incorporating, a touch style buttons, physical buttons and a touchpad on the screen. And it really makes for a really engaging game, and especially soundtracks that are, weeby and stuff like anime soundtracks and stuff like that. And I think a lot of people are underestimate Sega in the rhythm department because they see, rhythm games and think, oh, Bamani or something like that, or like Guitar Hero stuff like that. But I think Sega has a lot to contribute, especially with the Project Diva and Beneath Them arcade rhythm games. So I think probably one of those, in my opinion. And I think a lot of people should give more of this newer Sega stuff a try if they see it in the shop.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go with something that's a little bit of a selfish choice. I don't really know if this is like required reading for folks, but it's one of my favorites, and that's Top Skater. Because like in the mid 90s, like when I
forgot about that one.
When I played Top Skater, it was such a special game to me because I was a skater kid. You know, I skated with my friends. I loved punk music, so you had this like Pennywise soundtrack. And you got to use your body to play this game. You know, you of course you put your hands on the railings, but I mean, you would do these pop shove-its and ollies and rail grinds and stuff. And it was a very dynamic kind of game. You know, going down these very unrealistic kind of like courses where doing a lot of like,
Given the arcade thing wasn't broken at the time.
Yeah, well, yeah. When I played it, that's the sad thing is you just don't find those kind of machines in very good condition these days, because it was such a physical game, and people would just beat the hell out of those machines, unfortunately. So, you do find like Daytona USA still working, because it was pretty much just a steering wheel. You could kind of tune that up. But those for folks who didn't get to experience it, I can say is just Top Skater was such a fun skating arcade game. And again, like I never thought that I would see like a skating arcade game where it was all about pulling off tricks and racking up your points, because you'd have these little coins that you'd pick up, and then you'd kind of surf the half pipe. And it was just insanely fun with an awesome soundtrack. And of course, like there's a bunch of licensing stuff now because it had like Coke logos everywhere, and so I'm sure that it's never going to see the light of day in terms of like coming home to a console, which is really sad to me. But back in the 90s, it was definitely an impressive arcade game for sure, and it was one of my favorites.
It actually inspired the Tony Hawk's games. The developer of Tony Hawk, Neversoft, actually came out and said that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was inspired
by Top Skater,
because Top Skater is a fantastic. We had it in the bowling alley that I was, and there was always people on it because it's fantastic.
Yeah,
and it's one of these ones again where it's gut wrenching that Sega didn't bring that home in some way. It could have been great on the Saturn at the time. There would have been some compromises, and obviously you wouldn't have that the fantastic kickboard to skateboard peripheral to do it unless they brought one out. But oh man, it feels like a huge missed opportunity. But obviously, again, it's another game that you look at modern games, you look at how popular and how big Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise was at the time, and even the recent remake, and that's got Sega DNA in there to a degree because of that game.
Absolutely. And I mean, when I was a little kid, it was mostly the super scalar games that impressed me, like Galaxy Force or Outrun, Space Harrier. But it was when I was a teenager that all these like 3D, texture map 3D games were coming out. And that just, I don't know, they just hit in a different way, probably because I was a teenager and because I had more money to spend on the arcades, like I didn't have a whole lot of money to play Space Harrier, but I had a lot of money to dump into a Top Skater machine at the mall, or at the, at the movie theater. So that's what we ended up playing, I guess. So it really does come down to like, when you experience the arcades, when you were old enough to be able to kind of afford the arcades, that it adds to our experience. I wanted to ask, like, do any of you guys collect arcade boards? Because I know that's a thing, like in terms of like keeping that alive. Can any of you guys speak on that?
I collect a whole ass machines as well.
That's true.
But I do own a arcade-wise machine. I do own a Sound Voltex XC Gear machine and a Sega Net City. So
nice.
Great arcade machines. I'm a big fan of them. Board-wise, though, I also have a CPS 2. I have Neo Geo, of course, MVS because I can't afford the AES stuff.
Right.
And then, of course, some Titan stuff that Ben gave me. So.
Yeah,
I won't say limited, but a few arcade boards. I like doing it. It's a interesting hobby. I like doing both the super guns and also the making actual fight sticks for the super guns and actually putting them in the arcade machines. It's a lot of fun though.
Anybody else collect arcade boards or into that?
I have a few arcade boards. I mostly, way back in the day, man, if you go back to like 2005, 2006, I had an original Virtua Fighter cabinet, Virtua Fighter 2 cabinet. I had Daytona USA. I had a few others. I had a couple fighting games, a Neo Geo cabinet. I had a basement full of arcade machines. And then, of course, life changed for me pretty quickly. You know, space became an issue. You know, my wife is kind of like, these things have taken over. You need to freaking get rid of them.
Right.
You know, we moved into a smaller house, man, and that was like the catalyst that was like, they've got to go. So I ended up selling those, and in its place, you know, to sort of replace that vice, I started messing with arcade boards that were sort of like the Neo Geo, you know, where you could get different cartridges or different boards to slap onto those. So, you know, of course, I have Neo Geo, I have Sega's Titan, I've got CPS-1, CPS-2.
Nice.
I've got a Naomi. You know, I actually have a Chihiro that doesn't work anymore, which, you know, that really irritates the hell out of me. But
did you ever end up super gunning the Naomi at all, or getting that going?
The Naomi is actually a big problem, man, because you need the audio, and you need that in-out board for them, you know. And
yeah, no, I definitely know those things are problematic as heck. I already have a dead Naomi 2, and Naomi 1's going out the door soon. I feel like it's gonna kick the bucket. Those things are just so fragile, they just die for no reason, and they're just paying the ass to super gun.
Yeah, it's actually worse too, because, you know, when you get a Naomi set up, a lot of times, depending on the game you're looking for, each one has to kind of be set up differently, because not a lot of Naomi games were joystick and buttons, man. Like the better Naomi games were also light guns, they were steering wheels, you have a lot of stuff to set up, man. Whereas you didn't have that. You know, you didn't have that problem on something like a Neo Geo or a Titan or a CPS-2. You know, to get a Naomi running, not only do the things love to die on you, but it is an incredible amount of work to get each individual game so you can actually play the damn things. You know, so the Naomi is a real big headache. It's real similar to something like you know, some of the PC based stuff that would come out, you know, that was based on like the Xbox and the GameCube and whatnot.
Right.
I kind of, you know, dabbled in some of that way back then. And it was the same thing. It was like, oh man, I'm going to get me an original Outrun 2 board. And it's like, once you realized what you had to go through to get that actually up and running,
Right.
It was like, for the love of God, man, like I am not doing this. You know, so
yeah, some of those boards just they require machines. Like you have to, like
Yeah.
I'd love to play Initial D, but it's like you have to get, you know, all the bits and pieces of it. You need to get like the whole setup for it. It just
got to get a whole cab in order to make that experience the same, you know. I have an STV as well that I got from Ben, and it's got Die Hard Arcade. But I would like to get one of those the Dark Soft carts, or I want to get one of those that's like a multi cart that I can have all the games, especially Radiant Silvergun would be nice. But yeah, so
you know, if you go on eBay, man, there's actually a seller on there. I can send you a link. It's not a Dark Soft board.
Oh, okay.
But he makes these cartridges where he'll put 8 different games on the cartridge for you.
Yeah.
And it uses these dip switches where you can choose the game that you want, and you can get stuff like Radiant Silvergun, Guardian Force, Cotton.
Oh,
you know,
perfect.
I mean, yeah, you can get like the biggest hits for your board. And I think
the biggest hits,
the greatest hits, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you go with that direction too, they're maybe $200.
Yeah.
So they're not very
expensive.
expensive.
Send me a link. I'm interested. Yeah.
I will.
Any of you guys, Sega guys? arcade boards?
No, the only thing I've got is the arcade one-ups just there.
You do, right? Okay, I see that.
But as far as arcade boards and arcade machines are concerned, I've got nothing here. I'd love to have a little arcade project. That's always been a dream for me, and I keep thinking every year this will be the year, but I don't think it's happening.
What about a retirement garage cab or something like that? Anything in your future? Like if you could pick up one cabinet to put in your garage or something like that, what would it be?
If it could be one. that or Virtua Fighter. I think if it could be any cabinet, it'd probably be Outrun 2 or Afterburner.
Virtua Fighter would definitely take up less space.
Yeah,
you might convince the wife.
Exactly.
Dave knows exactly what my retirement arcade's gonna look like.
Yeah, well, Pat's already got one. Like he's got this little alcove in his house. I don't know what that room is supposed to be.
A den.
A den. Well, it's an arcade. It like works out perfectly.
Yeah, I just want an arcade. I just want the candy cabs lining down there, rhythm games.
Yeah,
I want to be Wii Paradise. That's my retirement goal. But I need to get a house first, and in this market, that ain't happening anytime soon.
True. Yeah. James, do you have like a cab that you wish you could get, or maybe you will one day?
In terms of one day, mate, that's not happening. Like literally, the spare room / office where my Sega stuff was all set up is now gone because it's been redecorated into a nursery pending the arrival of our second child in July. So, my Sega consoles are now downstairs in a unit underneath the living room TV. So, my wee area has got smaller. So, I think the chances of me trying to even find space in here, like for an arcade machine, are just like a no-go. I mean, if I could pick one, I still think as much as amazing as Outrun 2 is, the dream would have been like a twin-player Sega Rally cabinet.
Sega Rally twin. Okay.
I've got to have people around to play against, mate. That's that.
Yeah.
With that light that comes on, race leader. That's it. That's what you want.
Right.
But
well, you have to choose between a happy marriage or being all alone with your Sega Rally cab.
Just going to bed every night, cuddling Sega Rally. It's okay.
That's what I'm looking for. I want both. I want somebody that likes my arcades and is happy in marriage.
Good luck.
Godspeed, Pat. Godspeed.
Yeah. Maybe you'll meet her at an arcade somewhere. I don't know.
Maybe.
But that actually is a good transition into arcades today. I'm just curious. So, I mean, we talked a little bit of it before, and I don't want to sound like a, angry old man yelling at the sky kind of thing, Are there any, positive things that you guys can think about, in terms of the modern arcade or the barcade? Because I don't want it to all be negative.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK at least, there, Arcade Club, which, me and James met, and we spent a day up there on my birthday. There's a few chains of those around the UK. It's not just the Bury one that we went to, which I think is the biggest, the most well-known one. But there's about 4 or 5 around the country. And beyond that, there's a few other arcades. There's like Barcades in London, and there's also a similar where I live now in Milton Keynes. There's an arcade called the Pixel Bunker, which is similar to Arcade Club, but on a smaller scale. It's a single floor, but you go in, you pay your £10 or whatever it is, and you get unlimited play on a bunch of retro arcade machines. Now, obviously, we know that the scene, as far as what we used to know, I've been back to Margate and Clacton where I went as a kid, where there was just those huge floors of arcade machines, and they are now just ticket machines and coin machines. But you do see, the occasional pockets of traditional arcade games there. So Mario Kart Arcade GP, is that what it's called?
Oh yeah.
You see that a few times. House of Dead Scarlet Dawn, I've seen once or twice. So even though their presence is greatly diminished, they're still out there. And I think what's one of the most encouraging things, I know we talked a bit about it, James talked about it, the younger crowd going into the barcade. And I think I've said this before, but when we went for my birthday, it was the one place my wife thought, we can do anything for your birthday. She, in her head, I'll take him abroad or whatever. I'm like, no, I just want to go up north and play on arcade games. But I went up there, we took the family, I met James up there. My son was 16 the week after the weekend after, And when we asked him what he wanted to do, he straight away wanted to go straight back up. And he brought all his friends with him. So I say, well, he brought 4 or 5 friends with him. We drove up there again, 3 hours, with a bunch
Wow.
of, you know, teenagers. And these kids, right? They're all kids where, you know, they weren't born when this stuff was, you know, out there. You know, they're younger than Outrun 2. You know, these are all born 2007, 2008. But they've all gone there and just been absolutely in love with these old arcade games, you know. And they have got stuff, you know, they've got a section in Arcade Club where you've got a bunch of Xbox One S consoles and PCs, and there's like the Fortnite section. And you've got all that there, but that's not where these kids gravitate to. They all go to the old arcade machines. And when they all came out, they were all buzzing about it. They were all talking about how much they loved being in there. So yeah, the arcades as we knew them growing up, they aren't the forefront of, you know, gaming technology anymore. They aren't as ubiquitous as they once were, but there's still a magic to them. And somehow that magic still transcends generations and still appeals to that younger demographic. And the fact that these places do exist is still encouraging. Likewise in Japan, you know, again, when I went over there, in the big cities, in Osaka, in Tokyo, in the Akihabara district and Shinjuku, there's still huge, massive buildings, multi-floors. And yeah, the bottom few floors are all gachapon, rhythm games, etc. But on the top floor, there's still a huge following, especially for games like Street Fighter 6, which Street Fighter 6 just got a new arcade release in Japan just a few months ago, and there's a big buzz around that. And obviously, Virtua Fighter Ultimate Showdown, or Virtua Fighter Esports as it's known out there, or Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter 3 TB Online, also very prominent in those arcades. They weren't as busy for local players, the Street Fighter and Tekken machines, but you could get online games with them. And that's kind of an encouraging thing to see as well, I think, is that fighting side of things. I mean, the fighting genre carried the arcades for a while. I mean, I think the arcades were on a bit of a downturn before Street Fighter 2 hit, you know, and the fighting game genre helped revitalize those arcades. And I think that's still kind of the case now, that they carry it to a degree. And you've still got the initial D games, the card games and the room games that top it up over there. So the arcade isn't the same. I don't think it's entirely dead. And, you know, if it continues to appeal to a younger generation, hey, it could always make a comeback in some form, I think.
Yeah, like I said, I think the Bastion arcade has changed, but I mean, even out here, a lot of it is like a lot of the barcades, at least in Arizona, there's a ton of arcades. There's a ton of like little mini arcades that people just pay to play for all day or something. Even like in, I don't know, the West Coast, there's a really big arcade market, especially with the retro stuff. Like even at Game On Expo, Dave, I mean, that arcade was always packed.
Yep.
That
And
arcade was bumping.
PRGE, like they put a lot of machines on the floor there, and pinball too. So yeah, I appreciate them doing that.
Yeah, like the Bastion arcades is definitely, I've seen the West Coast. I don't know about the East Coast as much. I don't see a lot out there as much as the West Coast, but like I said, there's a lot of that. And like even if everything else fails, my house will be the last stand of arcades. I'll keep those.
Everyone gets a pet.
Yeah, you're all welcome over anytime.
Yeah. Mel, do you want to say anything about the modern arcade as it is?
Oh man, well, you said you didn't want to be negative, man, and I'm gonna.
No, that's okay.
I'm gonna have to be.
We need some devil's advocates in
one.
here.
The thing is, I'm probably right there with you.
Well, let me just tell you my experience, because once again, I want to stress that I live in a mountain town, and see, very much unlike you, the arcade is dead here. It's gone. There's nothing left. There's no arcade at the grocery store. There's no arcade at the Pizza Hut. There's no arcade. It's gone. It's dead. Unless you live near a population center of any kind of size, there's nothing. It's gone. There's no barcades. There's no preservation. There's nothing. And this is what I don't think many people understand, because a lot of people do live near something of some kind of size where they're seeing some type of preservation. So they think to themselves, oh, there's still preservation. There's still options. The arcade's not dead. Brother, I would love to bring your ass down to where I live at. I'll put some gas money in your pocket. I'll give you a week and I'll let you drive around and you come back and tell me what you found. You know, you might find a Pac-Man machine at a bar stuck in a corner, you know, some shitty little dive, man, but you're never going to find an arcade. And that, man, is what sucks, because in the 80s and 90s, arcade machines were everywhere.
Yeah.
We didn't realize it in the 90s, but the arcades were in steep decline in the 90s.
Yeah.
We kept seeing the upticks of successful games like Street Fighter 2 and Daytona USA, and the really good games that would pick the industry back up from complete collapse and kept it limping along. But by the end of the 90s, the arcades really started to disappear, at least in my experience, around most of America, man. If you were in a small town, your arcades left. Your businesses that carried arcade machines left and didn't really leave any substitute. And then when I do get in my car and I drive to someplace like Richmond or DC for 2 or 3 hours, the vast majority of what I find is ticket centers.
Yeah.
So not only did I have to drive 3 hours to win a $2 fucking stuffed animal, you know, but on top of that, what I'm faced with, and I do apologize to our buddy Pat here, but I fucking can't stand rhythm games, man. Like you sit me in an arcade and I'm surrounded by people doing rhythm games, man. I just want to rip my hair out and scream, dude. I can't stand it. So I go into a modern arcade and it's like ticket and coin games, and it's people dancing to crappy ass Japanese music. And it's just like, oh my God, what am I doing?
Mel ain't living the weeb life.
No.
No. But I will say this, where there is preservation, where there are bars trying to keep it, where there's a galloping ghost or some type of equivalent, man, you don't realize how lucky you are if you live anywhere near something like that. Because I don't have it. Hours I would have to drive to find even something remotely similar. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people in this country, because let's face it, you got some population centers on the West Coast, you got some population center in the East Coast, a couple of big towns in the middle, but the rest of America is just a bunch of broke ass people without arcades. And that's the reality of it, man. Yeah. That's what's going on. Believe it or not, our mall closed down. The indoor mall, you know, closed down, man. And I realize that's a common thing now, but who would have thought that would have happened back in the 90s? Like whole indoor malls closing down. But the one here closed down. And of course, that meant that the arcade was closing down. And of course, this was the only arcade that was left in this town. And, you know, it was the only arcade really in our entire area, man. So I decided to go visit it before it closed down because I hadn't been there for a few years. So I walk into this place, man, and the asshole that owned it had jacked the sit-down prices of every single deluxe cab up to $2 to play it. Every single screen had burn-in. Every one. I could go around and see burn-in in every single one. The LCDs that were replaced in a few of them had no bezels around them. So it was literally a television just sat in front of the dead CRT.
Oh my God.
Okay. Now, most of the minimum effort, wanting a premium price.
I bet you want to sell for a premium price too.
Yeah. So when the place goes out of business, like I was actually curious because he had a few machines that did work, and I was thinking I could do something with them. So I go there and I inquire about his House of the Dead, which did have burn-in, but I'm thinking, man, I know people that deal in old CRTs. I can get this replaced. I'll have my own House of the Dead. I can talk my wife into it. I'm positive I can. So I go there to talk to this fucker, And he tells me no, he doesn't want to sell any of this stuff. And so, you know, I'm like, at first I'm like, oh, okay, the guy just wants to collect them and whatnot. And it's like, no, he's not. He's actually keeping them because he's selling them to some company that basically is almost like it used to be back in the day, where they would be an amusement company and they would sell these arcades to, you know, businesses that dealt in them. Like, you know, you have barcades primarily today, but you also have like what's that one called that just opened up there? It's got Japanese games.
Round One.
Yes, Round One. I mean, they will actually move some of these games to those types of places too. And that's what he's doing with them. And that's when I kind of realized that's something else that was happening, was all of these arcade games that did exist in these small towns are being ferried out to these bigger population areas for places like barcades and whatnot.
Wow.
So every time you see one of these places, you have to realize, man, that arcade came from someplace, probably like my podunk little mountain town, and that's why we don't have that kind of stuff anymore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
so gentrification of arcade machines.
Yeah, it's like gentrification. Yeah, I mean, stealing from small towns to feed the larger, you know, denser populations.
But yeah, I mean, it's something that struck me that I had never really thought of before when this guy was telling me what he was going to do with these old machines. And it hit me. It was like, oh my God, that's why nothing's around here anymore. It's all been soaked up in other places by people moving them to places where they will continue to be used, you know, in these areas that have a lot more people. So yeah, that kind of depressed me, because it made me realize I was never going to get a big arcade here again. I was never going to get somebody that was going to open up a barcade with any substance to it, because the area is so small. It's just, there's no business that exists anymore where that kind of thing, you know, can continue, where it can, you know, keep going. And it depressed the hell out of me.
Yeah,
as it should. Like a thing, I think I just got way lucky here, because a lot of the arcades and the stuff that are out here are all like owners of, like, you know, independent business owners that buy these machines or fix them up. Like these aren't like entertainment centers. Like, okay, we have these people that are dedicated that have it out here in Arizona. So that's why I think I'm lucky in that aspect. And I think really the only reason it's as big as it is that I just got really lucky with people having the passion for the arcades out here and the retro stuff.
Yeah. Well,
because every one of the machines that was in that NQ64, they all had severe burn-in.
Yeah. That's like such a shame.
House of the Dead literally had insert coin permanently on the screen as you're playing it.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
Yeah. We saw at PRGE, we saw one of those X-Men arcade, the wide screen, you know. That was worse for wear too. Like it had the one monitor that was in pretty good condition, and then one that was like several tones darker, you know, like it was, you know, where they just start dying because they're just not as bright, you know. And it was
pretty bad.
And it was the one that was upside down, because it's like mirrored, you know, to create the widescreen effect. So it's like half of the screen is light and then half of the screen is dark, and you're just like, wow, man. I'm trying to imagine right now what it would have been like playing this back in the day, but it's hard. Yeah, so arcade preservation is really important, and I really admire what folks are doing, because it takes so much work. Like, it takes so much work and dedication, and these things, the CRTs especially, like, they're not making new ones, so it's like whatever you're able to source, you know, from new old stock or just, you know, low hours. It's a lot of effort that goes into like refurbishing those cabs, and you know, my hat's off to the UK for having such a scene, you know. I don't want to sound like I'm complaining with San Diego. Like, I'm sure other people will listen to this and be like, well, I'm from the area and we have some great places, but I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, you know. Like, they're okay, but it's not not quite like what Dan and James are talking about, which is why another reason why I want to visit the UK soon, so I can go to arcade club.
You get a SHIRO trip going, Dave.
We do. But my experience is largely like the Ticket Center with a few games thrown in there, like the Mario Kart GP or the House of Dead. You know, that's the experience. But most of it is like Ticket Center stuff, like Dave and Buster's. The barcades are good, but the machines have seen better days, and they've got selling beer on their mind. Like they're much more focused on the food and the beer than making sure that their machines are in tip-top condition. You know, it sounds like Arcade Club that you guys have in the UK is like a top-notch joint where they're really like focused on the arcade.
I wish I could have showed you around here, Dave. You would be like, "Wow, Patrick, you were just." There's just so much around here. Like honestly, if you got,
that's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah, if people want like I went back to the East Coast, there wasn't really much either. Like I don't want to go back to the East Coast just because I'm gonna lose out on all the retro stuff. It seems like Arizona is like, and even with like Game On Expo, I mean, as you see, like the stuff is just getting bigger and bigger out here, and it's just like the retro scene is alive and well in Arizona. So if you guys want to live that retro life, heck, really recommend Arizona. Yeah, for sure. Unless you live in the UK, then go visit the Sega guys. They know what's up.
I'm just going to say, after Mel's impassioned ranting, man, we need to get this guy to Arcade Club, man. We need to get him over here. It's like that's the thing with the Arcade Club as well. It was like 12 quid, right? And it's unlimited play. And like Dan and I were in there from like 12 o'clock and at lunchtime until 11:30 at night.
You stretched it
for 12 quid. Now the barcade, on the other hand, that was £15 to get in, and it got you a drinks token and 15 game tokens, and the games all took different amounts of tokens. So like Outrun 2, they want 2 tokens for a credit. Virtua Fighter, it's 1. House of the Dead, it was 2. Anything that was beyond a standard standing at a joystick, they wanted extra tokens to play it. And what you said, Dave, is right. It's like the focus is on, like, I think primarily the people are going there to get pished and have something to eat and then play some games. Like the games aren't primarily the draw. And you're right about the machines, about the condition of them. Like these weren't terrible, but they weren't. You could see they weren't given.
They need TLC.
They weren't given the TLC to Arcade Club. Like you walked into Arcade Club, those machines looked like they did. Like
it's an arcade. It's like an actual arcade. Yeah.
Whereas there's like stickers on the machines that says "drinks off, dickhead."
Yeah,
like they don't want it. It's like I was like, oh, okay,
right.
But
I'm sure not everybody has followed that because you'll get the
drinks off, dickheads. It's like I wasn't going to put my drink on it. It's like
right,
but some of the machines that the joysticks were a bit loose, some of the buttons were a bit unresponsive on some of them. So yeah, they're not given the TLC, and they're probably abused a lot more. Again, drunk people from like Glasgow, drunk Glaswegians smashing the shit out of arcade machines.
There's nothing sadder than finding an arcade machine in an unexpected place and sitting down to it and finding that it is just a MAME machine. Like and it has one of those really terrible LCD screens, and you're just like, no, everything's laggy, and it's just like, this is not at all what I remember.
It happened to me in an arcade. I sat down at one of those Vulex machines, and it was all like the really bad American part arcade Chinese stuff, and and really bad emulators. Like, oh man, this machine deserves better love.
Right. And we saw that at PRGE too. Like there were a few machines where they had to swap out LCDs, and the games just didn't look or feel the same, it's got to have the CRT, right? Because there's just, I don't mean to sound elitist with that, but it just doesn't feel the same.
I'll be elitist about it. I'll throw under the bus. Like, I mean, that X-Men arcade machine was atrocious.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can always pick up arcade compilations, right? And play them that way on an OLED or whatever. But I mean, there is something to be said for the experience of playing arcade games on a cabinet, with the joysticks and with the clickety buttons or the steering wheel and stuff like that. And so I would just urge people, if you have the opportunity, or if you're Mel and you have to drive to several other states in order to do it. But yeah, I guess it's like Mel said, if you are lucky and fortunate enough to have them near you, you know, I urge you to go check it out, you know, because it was something else, you know, and it was something we were all really fortunate enough to grow up with and just be completely surrounded with. And it really was, you know, a formative experience, and it really like shaped us as gamers, I think, you know, and our expectations for console games and just our entire experience. It wouldn't be what it was without the arcade, you know, whether it's a tiny little mom and pop's laundromat with a couple of Neo Geo machines, or if it's a huge resort with, you know, every game that you can think of under the sun. You know, arcades were really special, and that's something that, at least arcades as we know it, it's hard to find anymore. Like, it's hard to even convey that how unique and how special they were, you know, to folks now and have them really understand what you're talking about, you know. But yeah, anyway, I want to thank all you guys for doing this. Some of you had to get up really early in the morning, and there's others of us who are staying up very late, and I've kept you guys up now 2.5 hours, so appreciate it. And yeah, I think I'm just going to wrap it up and tell everybody that you guys must play arcade games. You guys got to go to your arcade and support your local arcade.
You must come to my house and play
or come to Pat's house and play. Yeah. So
if you like rhythm games, go to Pat's house. If you like traditional arcade games, come to Arcade Club.
Hey, I got a candy cab.
That's true. You do have a candy cab, but I know Mel's not coming near that Voltex machine.
more waifu anime games for me.
For you. Well, this has been SaturnDave TraynoCo, the Mega Driver, SEGAholic, and Sega Lord X, reminding you to go play your local arcade. And until next time, we'll catch you later. See ya.
Bye.
SLX